This is it, the ultimate dimension for rest and stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
The first sound was the clock, but not the rhythmic sort that guides moments forward. This one ticked as if unsure, pausing between each beat the way a person might before saying something honest. The room exhaled a faint scent of rain that no one could explain, something trapped inside the carpet fibers or perhaps carried in on their clothing. Morty sat in a chair that felt several decades older than the conversation waiting to happen. Its leather squeaked like it wanted to be part of the discussion. The therapist's office wasn't intimidating, just too neat. Books standing like polite guests, small paintings framed with unnecessary confidence. But the chair, the one that never faced the window, was where Rick sat. And somehow that detail already felt symbolic, like everything in Morty's world usually did, after a few seconds too long next to his grandfather. Rick didn't look at the therapist. He looked at the opposite wall, a spot slightly above eye level where the paint had bubbled into a vague oval. His expression was the same one he wore at funerals, graduations, and breakfast. Half analysis, half escape plan. Is this really happening? Morty asked, half a whisper, not wanting to startle the moment. Rick's reply took shape as a sigh. Define this, Morty. If by this you mean people pretending talking fixes people, then yes. Congratulations, you caught it in the wild. The therapist Laurie smiled the kind of smile practiced in candlelight. I'm not here to fix anyone, she said. I'm here so you can notice who keeps trying. Rick huffed, the sound small enough to be mistaken for a laugh. Morty, uncertain what to do with his hands, twisted the edge of a tissue until it became a long paper rope. The silence afterward felt thick but not cruel. Somewhere water from earlier rain tapped intermittently against the window pane. It was almost polite. Morty noticed the room had 4 chairs arranged in a loose circle, yet Rick's was slightly misaligned, angled away from the window. Everyone else faced the light. He wondered if it was deliberate, or if fate itself just resigned to Rick's gravitational pull of resistance. Laurie's voice drifted through, steady and even. You can start anywhere you like. There's no wrong entry point in memory, Rick answered before Morty could think. Good, because mine doesn't have a front door. The therapist nodded, accepting that as perfectly reasonable. She didn't write notes like other counselors Morty had glimpsed on television. Her pen hovered but rarely touched paper. Maybe she wrote invisibly. Maybe it was all memory work in real time. For a while, no one spoke. The air hum of the distant vent filled the room like white noise meant to disguise vulnerability. Morty caught himself matching its rhythm with his breathing. Inhale, hum, exhale. His body slowly remembered it was supposed to feel safe somewhere once in a while. Rick cleared his throat. So, what's the thesis today? We take turns crying until emotional bonding occurs. Or do we get grades? Laurie's eyes softened. No one's keeping score here. Sometimes people begin with silence because it feels safer than accuracy. Morty looked at her, then at Rick, who pretended to check the fake dictionary on the side table. He always needed props when sincerity threatened to enter the room. You don't have to talk about the portal gun or the multiverse, she added gently. You can talk about breakfast if that's simpler, Rick smirked. Breakfast is a form of existential repetition. We could start there, she said. For the first time in years, Morty didn't try to correct or defend him. He just let the statement sit. A half-truth that somehow described them both. In the office's still light, particles of dust drifted slowly, each speck a small comet in orbit of larger silence. Morty watched them as if the room itself were breathing deep, matching humanity to furniture. He realized then that the smell of rain wasn't outside residue at all. It was nostalgia, his brain registering comfort it didn't yet trust. Laurie lifted a kettle from the corner table and poured warm water into 2 mugs. Tea, she asked. Rick raised an eyebrow, resigned. Make it theoretical. Chamomile, she said instead. Good for pretending. When she handed Morty his cup, the warmth rested in his palms like an introduction. He could feel himself calming without permission. Rick stared at his own mug as if suspecting surveillance. Steam rose between them, curling in vague shapes that looked briefly like constellations before fading. After a long minute, she asked softly, Rick, why that chair? He blinked. What about it? You placed it slightly off angle when you came in. It doesn't face the window like the rest, Rick shrugged. Habit. Windows are invitation devices. Better to face the exit. But the door's behind you, she reminded him. Morty saw it instantly, the flash of awareness in Rick's face like a tiny power surge, then the returning composure. Touché, he said, sipping air instead of tea. Morty wanted to laugh, but something about the exchange stretched a hidden string inside him. Maybe this was what therapy meant. Finding accuracy in the smallest geography of posture and orientation. The clock ticked, soft, hesitant. The tiny sound wrapped their silence like a lullaby from an untrustworthy nursery. Morty imagined the rain outside as applause for any progress at all. Laurie looked at him kindly. "Morty, what do you hope happens here?" He tried to answer honestly. I want everyone to relax for 5 minutes without someone vanishing," he said, surprised at his own clarity. Rick shifted but didn't speak. "That sounds like a beginning," Laurie said, nodding. "No discoveries required. Just rest." The words anchored themselves in the carpet. Rest. The family's rarest currency suddenly named aloud. The clock ticked again. Tick, tick. The therapy room smelled half of tea, half of thunder. Morty thought he could live in that scent if only briefly. Rick finally muttered, almost tenderly, "Let's not make a habit of this." Laurie smiled again, unfazed. That's usually how habits start. She dimmed the lamp slightly, leaving the soft halo of evening to claim the room. The shadows on the far wall converged just enough that Morty imagined them as figures sitting opposite, alternate versions of themselves already healed, watching with patience. For now that vision was enough. A quiet proof that beginnings don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they arrive disguised as therapy chairs angled the wrong way, because some people only face light after learning how to rest in shade. The clock ticked once more, confident this time. Rain whispered its steady applause on the glass, echoing a promise they hadn't yet earned but might one day keep. And in that small, imperfect stillness, the story truly began. The next afternoon arrived like a patient visitor. Grey outside, humid enough that the windows filmed over, leaving the world drawn in soft watercolors. Inside Laurie's office, the circle of chairs waited again, one leg shorter than the rest, wobbling just enough to remind everyone that balance often sounds imperfect before it feels true. Beth stood first, notebook clutched against her chest, eyes darting to and from Rick as if he might bolt at any moment. Jerry hovered behind her, his nervous smile installed like an emergency sign. Summer sank into the nearest chair, phone glowing defiantly bright before dimming on its own, her silent protest against performing sincerity. When Morty stepped in, they all looked briefly like strangers in coordinated discomfort. Rick arrived late, dragging his lab coat like weather. He nodded at no one, dropped into the misaligned chair and sighed as though gravity had personally betrayed him. The smell of rain still owned the carpet from yesterday. Laurie lit a small candle on the side table, its flame patient and balanced, pooling scent of sandalwood and distant campfires. "Welcome back," she said gently. "Today we speak of home." The word hung there, a balloon filled with complicated air. She continued, "Not where you live, what home means without a dress or walls." Beth exhaled a laugh that wanted to hide. "I think home is a moving target," Rick muttered, "and Rick's house of abandonment isn't zoned for stability." "That too," Beth said quietly. Laurie scribbled a note. "Good start. Let's try again. A single sentence each. What does home mean right now? Not yesterday, not ideally, but now." Morty swallowed first. "I guess. A place where people pause before they answer the phone. Where emergencies don't sound constant." Summer tilted her head his way, the faintest smile of alignment. "For me, home means silence, but the good kind, like headphones after a long subway ride." Jerry hesitated. "Home is insurance I haven't paid yet," he said, almost apologizing halfway through his sentence. "Sorry, I just mean it's something I keep promising to maintain." Beth rolled her eyes with a practiced elegance. "Home is where someone finishes a sentence without someone else correcting it." Rick sipped imagined coffee from the air, eyes unfocused. "Home is noise, I understand." Laurie looked at each of them as though evaluating invisible constellations. "Beautiful," she said. "All of you. Sometimes home isn't a noun. It's a rhythm you stop hearing when it works perfectly, the words unspooled between them, quiet but adhesive." Morty noticed for the first time how the candle's flame pulsed when someone spoke, less flicker than breath. He leaned slightly toward it, hypnotized. Every family needs a center of gravity, and for this hour it appeared to be a bit of fire in a therapist's calm hands. Laurie asked, "Would anyone like to tell me what's wrong that brought you here?" Rick smirked. Spatial anomalies, metaphysical drift, emotional wormholes, the usual. Summer chuckled quietly, and because no one reprimanded her, laughter gathered courage. Even Beth's mouth softened. Jerry, relieved, leaned back too far and nearly tipped over. Rick caught the armrest of his chair and steadied him, an instinctive gesture so natural it silenced the room. "Thanks," Jerry whispered. "No equations required," Rick replied. Almost gentle, Laurie noticed. "That was an act of home," she said softly. Unscripted kindness tends to arrive when we stop running our internal rehearsals. They sat with that. Light pressed through the cloud-clogged windows, weak but tender, like morning forgiving itself for taking too long. Beth opened her notebook, pretending to jot something. But Morty could tell she was drawing again, the tiny origami cranes from the dream she'd murmured about the other night. He watched her fingers sketch their wings with the precision of someone renaming rage as art. Laurie asked, "When was the last time you each felt understood?" Morty stared at the floor. "Yesterday," he said, surprising himself. When the clock stopped ticking for a second, Rick gave a small snort. "Even broken clocks get empathy from you, huh?" Morty shrugged, half smiling. "At least they keep trying to start again." "Observation accepted," Rick said. Beth leaned forward. "I felt understood when someone fixed the leaky faucet last week, instead of suggesting a dimensional solution." Jerry raised his hand, proud. "That was me." Beth's expression softened. "Yeah, I know." Summer tapped her phone screen, though it was off. "I felt understood when nobody asked if I was still mad about last year. Are you?" Rick asked carefully. "Usually less when people don't ask," she replied. Laurie interjected with that deliberate softness therapists master. "Notice how everyone's proof of connection involves being seen mid-imperfection. Families don't bond over flawless outcomes. They bond in the drafts," Rick muttered. "Speak for the non-geniuses. Even geniuses keep drafts," she countered. He met her eyes a second too long and looked away. The small detour vulnerability takes when it's not sure it has. Clearance. Morty folded his hands in his lap, absorbing the rhythm of their talk, realizing he hadn't clutched the edge of the seat once. Something in the air shifted from interrogation to lull. The hum of the ceiling vent shushed like a gentle chorus. The candle leaned sideways, then stabilized. Laurie finally said, "Let's finish this session differently. I'll ask one sentence, you each answer honestly. No interruptions." They nodded. She asked, "What's one thing in this room you trust will still be here next week?" Jerry pointed to the clock. "That stubborn tick," Beth said. "That chair Rick insists doesn't face the window." Summer smiled. "The candle. I think it likes us," Morty answered. "The smell of rain. It sticks around even when the door's shut." All eyes turned to Rick. He paused so long a second hand could have graduated with honors before he spoke. "The therapist," he said finally, voice a note lower. "She seems harder to break than the rest of us." Laurie inclined her head. "We'll test that theory together." The session eased toward its end the way dusk replaces day without announcement. They sat for a few breaths, letting stillness collect naturally. The candle burned lower, half its wax spilling like sleep into a cradle of glass. Beth closed her notebook. Summer powered off her phone completely. Jerry adjusted his chair so it no longer creaked. Rick slouched deeper, the anti-posture of someone secretly at peace. When they finally stood, Laurie didn't dismiss them formally. She just said, "Remember, this room breathes a little easier when you do." As they filed out, Morty glanced back. The flame on the candle gave one last tremor, its brief bow goodnight, before settling into perfect steadiness. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving puddles shaped like commas along the path, reminders that some sentences weren't over, only pausing for breath. The family walked to the car without speaking, their reflections shimmering alongside them. For the first time in a long time, no one hurried the silence away. The morning began ordinary enough, which is usually when extraordinary things decide to stretch. The therapy office waited the way an unopened book waits, a little too quiet, a little too certain it still remembered the plot. Morty was the first to arrive. Laurie greeted him through a half-smile formed around a mug of green tea. "Early bird?" She said, "I couldn't sleep," he confessed. "The house has this new silence, I keep thinking we forgot to turn something off. That's the sound of still running systems behaving, she answered kindly. He nodded. Not sure if she meant the appliances or his family. One by one, the others filtered in. Summer wore headphones, but no sound came through them. Beth carried notebooks again. Jerry balanced 2 takeaway cups, though only one contained coffee, and Rick trailed behind, moving like static newly given shape. Rain threatened beyond the window again, same grey light, same diffused edges that turned every reflection into a memory rehearsal. Laurie straightened the blank worksheet stack and asked, "Everyone ready to begin?" Silence fluttered. So she rephrased, "Then let's begin by not beginning. Just breathe for a minute." They obediently scattered their breaths around the room. The clock ticked like a metronome, reassuring itself. Morty's gaze fell on the clipboard resting by Laurie's elbow. It stood vertically on a pile of notes, perfectly still, until it didn't. Without breeze or touch, it trembled, then tilted upright as if drawn skyward by a string. "Ah," Morty murmured. No one noticed yet. He blinked to be sure. Yes, it was rising, deliberate and slow, an ascension of office supplies. Rick's eyes eventually caught the movement. "Great," he muttered. "Furniture learned levitation. Must be one of your mindfulness side effects." Laurie frowned, gently unaware. "What do you see?" Morty pointed. "That!" The clipboard floated a few inches above the table. Paper curled like tongues of a candle. Everyone froze. The flame in the nearby candle flickered once, matching its rhythm. And then, just as gracefully, the clipboard descended, landing flat with a soft click that sounded almost like punctuation. Jerry attempted a laugh that came out too high. I always thought therapy was supposed to lift our spirits, not office supplies." No one joined him, but the tension cracked just enough to breathe through. Laurie inspected the table. Nothing peculiar. No magnets, no wires, no prank evidence. She looked at Rick. "Any theories?" Rick shrugged. "Could be air pressure, temperature shift, cosmic irony. Pick your poison." Or, she nudged, sensing the unspoken. He sighed. "Or maybe the room's reacting. Absorbing emotion, spitting it back. Quantum empathy, domestic grade." Beth crossed her arms. "You mean this place is haunted by feelings?" "Haunted, sure. Feelings, definitely," Rick said. "It's like physics running a group hug." Laurie smiled faintly. "Then perhaps we treat the room as another participant. Welcome room." Summer laughed before she could stop herself. "Do we pull out a 5th chair?" "If it helps," said Laurie, almost serious. She wrote a single line on her pad. Observation, physical manifestations of tension. Then looked up. Objects respond to energy, so do we. Let's focus on the feeling right before it happened. Anyone sense something rising? Morty lifted one shoulder. "Mostly my panic." Beth said, "Annoyance, maybe." Jerry was clicking his pen again. Jerry looked wounded. "It helps me think," Rick leaned back. "Helps the rest of us plot homicide," Laurie observed quietly. "Interesting." Right before movement, air thickened. Then laughter arrived, energy released, clipboard returned. "Release equals gravity regained," Summer whispered. "So the room breathes." "Too?" "That's one way of putting it," Laurie said. They sat inside that thought for a while, half wondering if breathing together might make more things float. Outside, a car hissed past on wet pavement, its sound stretching like a drawn violin. The world beyond remained practical, while theirs gently tipped toward myth. Laurie finally said, "Let's talk about control. What happens when something moves that you didn't command?" Beth spoke first. "You check if you caused it, and when you didn't. Then you make up a reason fast enough to keep sanity intact." Rick nodded approvingly. "See? Denial, a renewable energy source." Morty glanced at the clipboard again. It stayed still now, humble. What if it was just trying to help? He said, half joking, half 12 years old again. Like it couldn't handle the silence, so it gave us something to talk about. Rick smirked. "Congrats, Morty. You've invented sentient stationery." Laurie, though, considered it seriously. Sometimes the smallest event gives permission for wonder to re-enter the room. Maybe the clipboard simply volunteered. Summer looked at her phone camera, then set it down. There's no point recording it. "It'd just look fake." "Precisely," Rick said. "True things always do," Laurie chuckled. "Then we agree this was real enough for meaning and harmless enough for metaphor." Everyone exhaled simultaneously, releasing the sort of collective relief usually reserved for landing planes. "Fine by me," Rick said. Call it a miracle, call it a draft. Let's not get doctrinal. Laurie poured water into glasses, the sound smooth and grounding. It was the antidote to supernatural speculation. Each sip brought them back to the clock's manageable tempo. Beth murmured, "So what's the homework for this kind of event?" Laurie smiled. "Notice what else responds when you stop controlling it. Plants, pets, each other. See what rises." Rick grumbled but took the hint. "You realize if people start floating at dinner, I'm blaming you." "That's fine," she replied. Blame often marks the first layer of faith. The window brightened briefly as sun escaped the clouds, washing the walls with grey-gold sheen. Dust motes lifted softly, shimmering mid-air. Morty stared at them, wondering if light itself liked being trusted this much. He turned toward his grandfather. For once, Rick wasn't avoiding the window. His profile in that pale light looked almost peaceful, like a statue reluctantly carved from fatigue. Laurie closed the notebook on her lap. Today's theme, things we can't hold still. They teach us movement doesn't equal threat. As the group rose, Jerry reached for the clipboard, careful, slow. It didn't move. He smiled awkwardly, placing it flatter than before, patting it as if comforted. "There you go, staying grounded," he muttered. Morty caught Rick's eye. "You think it'll happen again?" Rick shrugged. "Everything does eventually." Outside, drizzle recommenced, tapping polite fingers against the glass. The candle flickered once, not alarmed, not spectral, just breathing. When they finally stepped into the hallway, Morty glanced back. The clipboard had tilted slightly to one side, angled toward the window Rick used to avoid. Maybe rooms learn from their guests. Maybe healing is just rearranged furniture. It began halfway through the next session, in that half-awake space where focus turns syrupy and the eyelids learn the rhythm of candlelight. Beth hadn't meant to drift. She never allowed herself to, but Laurie's voice had become hypnotic, rising and falling like an unhurried tide. Outside, clouds pressed low and heavy against the windows, dimming the room until dusk pretended to arrive early. The air smelled faintly of chamomile and old pages. It was the kind of scent that carries memory disguised as weather. Laurie was speaking about safety, how the body recognizes it long before the mind signs off. Beth heard the words only as texture now, silky consonants washing into the backbone of silence. Somewhere in that mild quiet, her chin tipped forward, her hand relaxed its grip on the pen, and the lines between thought and dream softened into one. She stood in sunlight. The therapy chairs were gone, the carpet replaced by grass so green it felt rehearsed from childhood stories. Rick was there too, not the old wry version peppered with fatigue, but younger in shock, the half-reckless face she knew only from a few photographs. His lab coat shimmered like heat above asphalt. In his hands he folded a piece of paper with almost surgical precision. It took her a moment to realize what he was building. Cranes, dozens of them, each crease exact, every angle sharp enough to remember. He glanced up, saw her watching, and instead of sarcasm, smiled. "Gravity's overrated," he said quietly, balancing one on his palm. "Look!" The tiny paper bird trembled, then hovered. For a breath, it existed in defiance of physics and family patterns, wings fluttering in the still air. She laughed, a sound she hadn't given herself in years. "They only stay up if you believe the fold is honest," he added, his voice almost kind. Beth wanted to tell him she didn't believe in belief anymore, but the words wouldn't form. The cranes began circling her like small moons, their paper wings whispering as they passed. Each whisper carried a phrase she hadn't said aloud. "I wanted to build like you. I hated building without you. Come home next time." A breeze stirred. The birds drifted higher, becoming bright outlines against summer sky. Rick watched them, eyes reflecting equations she couldn't translate to language. "Why cranes?" she asked. "Why not stars or something you understand?" He shrugged. "Stars don't fit in pockets." The scene folded at its corners. Sunlight bent, and suddenly she was small again. Bare feet on the garage floor, her father's hands guiding hers over new paper. "Press, not crush," he instructed. "It's a fine line." She looked up then, and the younger Rick overlapped perfectly with the older one. Time stacked like transparent slides, each version visible through the other. When she blinked, the ceiling light of Laurie's office flickered back into shape. The dream air retreated but left its scent behind. Paper warmed by hands, carbon ink, something else. Maybe forgiveness in vapor form. "Beth?" Laurie's voice was distant, gentle. You with us? Beth straightened quickly, embarrassed. Sorry, I must have drifted. No apology necessary, Laurie said. Sometimes rest finds the only way in it can. Rick gave a knowing smirk. I told her the sessions were boring. Laurie ignored it. Would you share what you saw if you remember? Beth hesitated. Just him younger. Folding birds that shouldn't fly but did. Laurie's eyes softened. Sounds like the part of your mind that still trusts wonder. I don't trust it, Beth corrected. I just miss it. Rick frowned, something unreadable darkening his expression. Did I at least get the mechanics right in your dream? You did, she admitted, trying not to smile. You always did. Morty, listening carefully, looked between them. There was new calm in the air, tentative but real, the post-storm quiet that often masquerades as exhaustion. Laurie said, dreams arriving inside sessions aren't interruptions. They're collaborations. Jerry chuckled nervously. So, do we charge extra for shared custody of her subconscious? Humor is welcome currency, Laurie replied. Beth leaned back, closing her eyes again, not to drift but to catalogue what stayed. She could still feel the feather-light touch of folded wings brushing her arm, the weightless rules of imaginary aerodynamics. For the first time in a long time, her father's presence didn't feel heavy. It felt methodological, curious, even human. The conversation moved elsewhere, Rick and Jerry's light argument about whether placebo therapy counts as science. But Beth half listened, half traveled back into the echo of her dream. In that remembered field, paper cranes still circled lazily, unbothered by logic, performing the delicate labor of staying aloft. She realized they weren't proof of magic. They were proof of attention, a child's folded hope surviving in corners where cynicism couldn't reach. Laurie's voice cut softly through. Beth, what are you thinking now? That maybe forgiveness is muscle memory, she said. Once you did it once, you can't entirely forget how. Laurie smiled. Bodies remember the choreography long before reason writes the sheet music. Rick looked away, pretending to adjust the crooked blinds. The window showed them a world washed pale with evening rain. Droplets lined up like punctuation marks waiting to form their next sentence. The session clock chimed faintly, signaling time. None of them moved yet. The group sat with a shared hush, listening to thunder roll somewhere distant. Sound soft enough to cradle. Not alarm, Laurie concluded quietly. Every family carries unfinished origami. Beth laughed under her breath. Then maybe that's okay. Imperfect folds still take flight when the wind is kind. Rick raised a brow but didn't argue. A small silence followed, gentle as a sigh closing its loop. On their way out, Beth folded the page corner of her notebook into a tiny triangle, half crane, half placeholder. She slipped it into her pocket without looking and realized the motion felt automatic, as if her dream version had taught her again what her waking self had forgotten. Later, at home, she set the folded scrap on her nightstand. Under lamplight, its paper wings caught a faint draft from the open window and lifted a few centimeters, hovering for just a heartbeat before falling silently back. Beth smiled at the air. Press, not crush, she whispered, repeating the ancient instruction. The paper waited, perfectly still, honest in its second of flight. Rain slicked the roads that afternoon, the kind of rain that didn't chase you but simply stayed, floating down like it had nowhere else to be. By the time Morty reached the office, the smell of damp earth had already folded into his jacket. The building greeted him with the same low hum it always had, fluorescent lights wrapped in polite fatigue, the faint tick of the clock still one soft beat short of exact. He realized that the sound had become its own welcome, proof of a space trying to keep rhythm even when people couldn't. Rick was already there, spinning his empty coffee mug by the handle, a ritual of controlled restlessness. Laurie, calm as ever, adjusted her notebook but hadn't opened it yet. Beth and Jerry arrived together for once, trading logistics instead of arguments. Summer trailed in last, eyes tired but curious. The group settled, and Laurie's voice slipped over them like a blanket straightened after restless sleep. Today, she said, we'll talk about endurance. The quiet act of staying. Morty didn't know why that word made his chest tighten. Endurance. It sounded noble when athletes said it, but when families said it, it felt like survival disguised as patience. Laurie continued, endurance isn't strength or stubbornness. It's the art of still being here. Rick muttered something about how existing was statistically overrated, but his tone lacked venom. She turned to Morty first. "Would you like to start? You've been listening more than speaking lately." He blinked as though caught inside fragile light. Everyone's eyes turned toward him, even Rick's, half behind sarcasm, half behind worry. Morty searched for something rehearsed and found only the truth. "I used to think heroism was leaving," he said quietly. "Like going out there, saving things, fixing whatever went wrong. Now it just feels like staying is harder." The sentence floated in the air between them, gentle but sharp enough to open the silence. Laurie tilted her head slightly in encouragement. "Can you tell us what made it harder?" Morty exhaled. "Because staying means you hear everything. You can't just teleport out when the noise starts. You have to listen, and sometimes that's the brave part." No one spoke right away. Even the clock ticked slower, respectful. Rick stopped spinning his mug. Beth's fingers touched the edge of her notebook as if bracing against wind. Jerry tried. "I always thought leaving was brave. You know, choosing a new start." Morty shook his head. "Starts aren't brave. Continuing is." Rick cleared his throat. "You practicing to replace the fortune cookie industry, kid?" Morty smiled faintly. "Guess I got tired of getting half the advice and none of the credit." Laurie smiled. "That's what an admission feels like when it's honest. Light, but anchored." Beth reached out, resting her palm briefly on Morty's knee, a small gesture that said, "I heard you," without forcing a performance of sentiment. He looked down at it, the simple contact, and felt the kind of safety that has no fanfare, just existence warming into proof. Summer broke the moment softly. "I get what you mean, though. It's easier to escape than to stay for the awkward parts." Morty nodded. "Yeah, but leaving turns adventure into punishment. You don't notice that until you stop moving," Rick mumbled. "Staying gets you old, that's all." Laurie looked at him. "Or it lets people catch up to you." He didn't answer, but his posture tilted fractionally toward the group. She noticed. Everyone noticed. Outside, thunder thudded once, distant, not threatening, nature agreeing in punctuation. Inside, Laurie spoke again. "When you say staying, Morty, are you talking about family or self?" He thought for a moment. "Both. Staying where you are, even when you don't feel like a version worth keeping." The honesty stunned him. He hadn't planned to say it aloud. For a heartbeat, he looked at the floor in embarrassment. Then the weight began to lift. Not all, just enough to breathe longer. Beth squeezed his hand. Summer nodded without words. Rick looked elsewhere, not to hide tears but to give privacy. Laurie said, "That definition of endurance, choosing to remain, inside and around yourself, belongs in any dictionary I care to use." Jerry whispered something about cross-stitching it on a pillow, and everyone laughed, but quietly, grateful. Laughter didn't cancel pain here. It simply held its hand. Laurie leaned forward slightly. "When we admit what hurts, we give sound back to rooms that forgot it," she said. Morty just reminded this room of honesty's tone. The rain against the window strengthened, soft percussion keeping their rhythm. Each droplet streaked down like a small translation of thought. Morty listened, realizing it matched his own breathing. For once, no one rushed to fill the quiet. It was allowed to stay exactly as long as needed. After a few minutes, Rick repositioned his chair so it faced the window more fully, the same one he'd avoided since their first session. The small motion caught Morty's attention. Rick noticed and shrugged. "If you're going to talk about staying, might as well face where I usually exit." Beth smiled into her notebook, pretending to write. Laurie didn't comment, only noted the shift. Breakthroughs never announced themselves. They just reoriented slowly, like planets mindful of gravity. Laurie finally said, "What do we do with endurance once we find it?" "Use it sparingly," Rick replied. "Otherwise people expect it daily." Or, she countered, "we share it. So no one has to carry the full weight alone," Summer whispered. "That's what I keep forgetting." The group nodded together, little symmetrical movements, quiet agreements shaping themselves into comfort. Laurie reached for the tray on the side table. "This tea is different," she said. "Mint and lemon balm. The mix only works when heat and patience meet each other halfway." She poured for everyone, steam curling upward like something spirit-level gentle. Morty took his cup. It tasted both sharp and sweet, like a promise dressed in honest imperfection. He whispered thank you, not to Laurie specifically, but to the moment for not collapsing. For a stretch of time, nothing happened. They drank, rain fell, The fluorescent light flickered once, recovered. The absence of drama became its own luxury, Laurie concluded quietly. Today we learned that endurance isn't stoicism, it's softness that refuses to extinguish. She looked around the circle. Endurance is also contagious. You brought it in when you showed up again, Rick muttered. Guess we'll need booster shots then. Beth laughed softly. No side effects but empathy. The session wound down like music fading but not ending, the kind people hum unconsciously later on. As they gathered their coats, Morty looked outside at the pale glint of leftover daylight breaking through slate clouds. He felt strange gratitude, the kind that sneaks in under exhaustion and sets up quietly beside it. Rick passed him on the way out, brief pat on the shoulder, brief enough to pretend it hadn't happened. Morty didn't call him out. Some confessions aren't verbal. Some feel like warm fingerprints through fabric. In the parking lot, puddles mirrored the sky in silver patches. Morty paused by one, seeing his own reflection ripple outward until only clouds remained. For once he didn't rush to still the water. Sometimes the best proof of endurance is letting distortion happen and watching it settle on its own. He glanced back at the therapy building glowing gold in rainlight, solid, patient, quietly existing. Somewhere inside a clock ticked too softly, still offbeat but persistent. It sounded like breathing, learning a brand new pattern. The Thursday session began with confusion about time. Everyone arrived either early or late, depending on which clock they consulted. The hallway one claimed 5:30. The waiting room microwave glowed at 5:23. Rick's wristwatch, perpetually set to no standard time zone, announced noon somewhere cooler. The only consistent rhythm inside the therapy office came from the wall clock Laurie had hung above her. Bookshelves, a small brass relic with a heartbeat too soft for authority. It ticked irregularly, missing a beat here, then racing to make up for it, exactly the way families talk after long silences. Jerry was the first to notice. He entered humming a nervous tune, sat down and frowned upward. Is that thing off? Laurie looked. It's consistent in its inconsistency, she said. It helps keep us honest. For most people that would have been an acceptable metaphor, but Jerry was not most people. He stood, climbed onto the arm of his chair, and tilted the clock toward himself like a patient in need of diagnosis. So you can't just ignore a bad rhythm, he muttered. It gets under your skin. Rick raised an eyebrow. So do families, Jerry. We don't dismantle them. Speak for yourself, Beth said dryly. Laurie's smile widened, deliberate equilibrium. Perhaps we let him look. Curiosity rarely breaks more than neglect does. Jerry removed the glass facing with surprising care, exposing gears and a weak battery. The faint scent of dust and old metal filled the air. He found a screwdriver in his pocket. Morty blinked. No one questioned why he carried one. With each soft click of movement, tension uncoiled from the group, dissipating into the gentle scrape of screwdriver against brass. Summer whispered, "This is either genius or vandalism." Beth leaned toward Laurie. "He can't fix clocks. He once miswired the toaster into an existential crisis." Jerry glanced back, half offended, half amused. "I just made it reflective." Rick groaned, but Laurie gestured for quiet. "Let's watch," she said. "You might be surprised how repair work teaches participation." They did. The small sounds, metal tapping metal, the pause of breath before each adjustment, grew hypnotic. Jerry replaced the corroded battery with a new one Laurie fetched from her desk. When he snapped the cover shut, the clock cleared its throat. A crisp, punctual tick anchored in momentary perfection. "See?" Jerry said, face lit like discovery. "It just needed attention," Laurie nodded. "And what do you feel right now?" He hesitated. "Usefulness." Relief. Then, with a chuckle, also terror that it's going to stop again. "Why terror?" "Because everything I fix stops eventually. Appliances, marriages, confidence." Morty winced, a sympathetic echo. Rick looked at his son-in-law with unexpected softness. "When it works, enjoy the ticking. Entropy's problem, not yours." Jerry sat down slowly, screwdriver resting in his lap like a temporary peace treaty. "I just hate it when things stutter. Makes me think I missed my cue." Beth lifted her mug of tea. "Maybe that's life, Jerry. Background noise daring you to improvise." Laurie wrote a quiet note. "Sometimes people fix things not to save them, but to prove they still can." The sentence landed heavier than its weight. Morty could feel it settle in the room, each person turning it over internally like a smooth stone. Rick's eyes flicked toward Laurie. For once he didn't roll them. Yeah, Jerry whispered. I guess that's it. Laurie asked, what does the steady tick mean to everyone now that it's fixed? Summer said first. It's polite background noise again. Beth, proof that effort occasionally pays rent. Rick, a reminder sound doesn't equal progress. Morty added softly. It means time didn't give up on us while we weren't watching. Jerry smiled at that. No sarcasm, just relief. Nice description. Thunder rolled outside, not dramatic, merely conversational. The rain followed, brushing the windows in fine threads. It matched the ticking perfectly, rhythm meeting rhythm, an accidental duet between nature and measured human hands. Laurie leaned back, hands folded loosely. I think endurance and maintenance are cousins, she said. We maintain what endures by caring for it after it breaks. That's what families do, take turns holding the screwdriver. Rick snorted so quietly it became affectionate. Do we get safety goggles for the emotional shrapnel? Only if you stay for cleanup, she returned. The group laughed. Light found its way into the room despite the rain, silvering the edges of furniture. Beth noticed her father's reflection in the window, blurred, elongated, impossible. He looked relaxed, at least relatively. She turned away before he could catch her studying kindness in real time. Laurie said, Today's experiment is listening to what repaired things teach us before they wear out again. Jerry traced a finger along the clock's rim. I think it's saying thank you. Rick reached into his coat pocket and produced a sliver of steel about the size of a coin. Or it's saying you messed with its mortality, and now it's neurotic. That's projection, Laurie said. He smiled sideways. Told you I'm an excellent projector. The clock ticked on, undisturbed by them all. Its regular pulse calmed the air in ways words couldn't manage. Morty closed his eyes for a moment, following the beat, imagining it as the mechanical version of a heartbeat somewhere forgiving. He wondered if his family had just synced to time itself, even for one fragile minute. Laurie finally broke the quiet. I want you each to name something you've tried to fix in silence. Beth said, my childhood. Summer said, everyone's expectation of who I'm supposed to be. Jerry exhaled. My image of success. Morty thought a moment. Things I broke before understanding them. Rick leaned back. Gravity. They laughed, which somehow worked as confession too. Laurie smiled, closing her notebook. Good. Acknowledgement is repair's blueprint. Outside, the rain softened to mist. The air smelled rebuilt. The candle on the table sputtered once, a reminder that steady things sometimes cough just to prove they're alive, and then steadied. When they stood to leave, the clock kept ticking, confident. Jerry waited by the door a moment longer to watch it, eyes bright, a tender mechanic proud of a small success. When Laurie joined him, he asked quietly, Do you think it'll hold? It doesn't have to, she said. You held it. That was the point, he nodded, taking the words like a keepsake. Morty lingered near the window, watching his reflection fade into gathering dusk. Rick clapped a hand on his shoulder. Beth and Summer sorted umbrellas in silence. Laurie blew out the candle. The brief wisp of smoke curled upward, lazy and sweet, before vanishing entirely. As they stepped outside, the first glimpse of twilight caught the wet pavement, turning the street into a mirror stitched with gold. Morty looked back once. Through the half-open blinds, the clock still shone faintly, keeping imperfect time but doing it beautifully. Sometimes the heart's accuracy wasn't the point. It only had to keep beating, one hesitant tick after another, proving presence louder than precision. By the time the 7th session arrived, the world outside seemed to understand the rhythm of their meetings. Rain now waited politely until they were well inside before it began, as if Sky and family had made a secret pact about timing. The familiar scent of wet earth lingered at the doorway, like an old friend that no longer needed introductions. Laurie had arranged the room differently this evening. The circle of chairs had widened enough for space to breathe between them, and on the center table she had placed a stack of thick paper and a handful of colored pencils, dulled from past use. The candle from previous sessions burned higher than usual, its light climbing in quiet confidence. The erratic clock, still faithful to Jerry's repair, tapped a slightly steadier rhythm, as though soothed by applause only it could hear. Rick entered first this time, coat already draped over one arm. He glanced around, scanning for the usual arrangement of objects. "You moved furniture," he said. "Change invalidates scientific data." "Or refreshes it," Laurie replied. "Tonight we experiment differently." Beth followed, carrying a small box of tissues like a prop she hoped not to use. Summer came next, unwinding her earphones, letting one side dangle like an unfinished sentence. Jerry shuffled in last, proud but sheepish, nodding toward the ticking clock as if to remind everyone of his contribution to codependence. Laurie gestured toward the paper. "We've talked enough lately, so now we draw instead," Rick groaned. "Because abstract doodling cures generational trauma. Because sometimes pictures tell on feelings faster than words do," she said simply. Morty had to admit he didn't mind. Something about the scrape of pencil always calmed him, the way sound builds order silently. He picked the color closest to the blue of twilight. "What exactly are we supposed to draw?" Summer asked. "Each other," Laurie said. "No technical rules. No right way up. Just impressions of whoever sits across from you. And before you begin, a small rule: you may not erase anything. You may layer, evolve, even cover, but nothing disappears." Beth raised an eyebrow. "So it's coloring therapy with consequences." That's one interpretation. For several minutes, the room filled with nothing but the rustle of paper and shifting posture, the hush of creative focus that felt half prayer, half homework. Rick's pencil moved faster than expected. He drew in small exact lines, precision sneaking through even when pretending to mock. Morty peeked up and saw his grandfather's tongue pressed slightly behind one molar, the sign of concentration he'd known since childhood tinkering nights in the garage. Beth began in geometric shapes, triangulating everyone into architecture. Summer used colors first, building warmth before outline. Jerry attempted realism, and got heartbreakingly close to caricature. Morty scribbled something human and soft, uncertain but honest. When Laurie finally said, "Stop," they all looked surprised by how quickly time had passed. It was the first hour that had ended without anyone asking how much remained. She nodded at them. "Now trade drawings." Rick and Morty exchanged papers first. Morty smiled immediately. Rick's version of him looked almost heroic, the lines sharp but kind, a face focused outward, light sketched around the shoulders like gentle exhaust from existing. He hadn't expected admiration rendered so matter-of-fact. "You made me look," Morty whispered, searching for a non-embarrassing phrase. "Figured out." Rick shrugged. "I'm good at reverse engineering trouble." Morty turned over his own drawing of Rick, messy, raw strokes of grey softened by streaks of peach and gold. "How you look like math trying to be human," he said before realizing it sounded almost poetic. Rick gazed at the page a little longer than sarcasm allows. "Well," he said quietly, "math gets sentimental sometimes." Across the circle, Beth studied Jerry's attempt at her portrait, somewhere between comic book and confession. "You gave me wings," she noticed. "Mostly decorative," Jerry said. "Just thought you could use a lift." Her laugh, surprisingly gentle, filled the room like a curtain catching a new breeze. Summer showed hers last. She had drawn everyone but herself, using layers of transparent color that overlapped just enough to form one shape in the center, where all their outlines merged. "That's us," she said simply. Messy symmetry. Still holding. Laurie looked at the spread of papers, a mosaic of longing and affection disguised as art, and said, "Notice how none of the versions match, and yet each one is right. That's family perspective in pure form." Outside, thunder rolled in a low, contented tone, not a warning this time, just punctuation. Rain began in threads that tapped against the windows with rhythmic agreement. The sound-filled spaces words would have overcrowded. Laurie continued, "Let's talk about your process. Did you find yourself fixing what you drew or accepting it as it came?" Beth said, "I kept wanting to straighten everyone until I realized I was redesigning hearts as furniture." Jerry admitted, "I erased once before remembering the rule. Then I just drew over the mistake. It looked better afterward." "Layering becomes depth," Laurie said. "Sometimes correction is evolution in disguise." Rick twirled his pencil. "I'll grant you that. Even atoms rely on overlap." Summer tilted her head, watching him. "Did you just compare love to molecular bonding?" "If it helps you stay awake, sure." Laurie shook her head in quiet amusement. "You laugh, but the science fits. Things connect by sharing electrons they can't fully keep." Morty smiled. "I think that's exactly how families work. Beth touched the corner of Summer's drawing, tracing the color where everyone blended. I didn't realize how many shades we make together. Rick murmured under his breath, never thought I'd live to hear sentimental spectrums. Laurie heard him, but let it be. She said, let's finish differently today. Instead of analysis, let's gratitude each drawing. Find one detail you're glad exists. One by one they did. Beth thanked the small wings. Jerry praised the halo scaffolding. Summer pointed out Morty's use of blue, the soft between-storm kind. Rick complimented the way someone had given him open eyes, even though he'd drawn them closed. When it came to Morty, he hesitated. Then he said, I'm glad we did this without needing to be fixed first. Laurie smiled. That's the trick. Healing often arrives disguised as play. The clock ticked behind them, now perfectly synchronized with the rain outside. For a moment, sound and time braided like melody, different instruments sharing one rhythm. None of them wanted to move. Beth finally whispered, It's raining the way it did the day we learned Grandpa could float clipboards with stubborn energy. Coincidence, Rick said, but his voice carried more warmth than denial. Laurie gathered the drawings gently, not to keep but to arrange them in a single mosaic on the desk. Colors bled into each other until the table looked like dusk, distilled into paper, the world's quiet confession of connection. As we end, she said, remember this tableau. That's what communication looks like between questions. No interrogation, just witnessing. Morty exhaled long and slow, feeling the weight of calm spread like light in water. When they left, no one hurried to open umbrellas. They let the rain kiss their shoulders, proof that their newly drawn shapes existed outside the page. In the window behind them, the candle burned steady, a small moon holding vigil. The mosaic shimmered faintly under flame light, 5 perspectives sharing one softness, unfinished yet entirely enough. Evening folded itself over the small office, like a blanket pulled carefully to the chin of the day. The storms had finally wandered elsewhere, leaving behind cool air and that faint metallic scent that follows rain when it has finished apologizing. Laurie lit no candle this time. In its place glowed a single table lamp, shaded gold, the familiar flame of a night that intended gentleness rather than revelation. Rick arrived late, though no one commented. His coat was damp at the edges, his hair carrying enough static to magnetize dust. He sat down heavily, a sigh disguised as posture. Laurie waited, patient as a heartbeat. She didn't even open her notebook. Morty knew that look. It was the pre-question pause, that delicate moment when silence becomes both permission and dare. Laurie finally said, Tonight's focus may feel uneven, but that's all right. We're a set of shifting stories. Rick, may I ask you to start yours? Rick grimaced. Therapy roulette. I lose the spin again, huh? Yes, she said simply. He stared at the lamp's reflection in his empty mug. Fine, I'll tell a story. You people like metaphors anyway. Beth stiffened. Jerry took a defensive sip of tea he'd poured himself poorly. Summer crossed her legs in the universal pose of skepticism disguised as poise. Morty leaned in, somewhere between dread and curiosity. Rick began, voice soft, unalarmed. A while back I tried an experiment. Not the interdimensional disaster kind, the small human-scale variety. I wanted to know what a memory smelled like. Turns out every emotion has a signature frequency and, an odor. Joy hums bright, metallic, quick to evaporate. Guilt sits heavier, kind of iron and ash. Love is smoke that refuses to dissipate. He paused, gauging their faces. Laurie nodded for him to continue. So I built a machine, of course I did, that could distill memory into scent. Real laboratory Frankenstein nonsense. I figured if I could bottle regret, I could control it. Give it shape, label, dosage. But guess what the first sample smelled like? He looked directly at Beth. Wet grass, she said softly. Summer mornings before Mom left. Rick swallowed the ghost of a smile. Yeah, see, I thought that was tranquility. Turned out it was unresolved affection clotting in nostalgia's arteries. I kept trying to capture it again, tweak variables. But the more I chased one honest scent, the more everything started to smell like burnt ozone. Jerry asked, earnest as only Jerry could be. Did it work? I mean, did you cure regret? Rick snorted. Sure, if by cure you mean weaponize. People layered synthetic fragrances over the truth. The design worked. Smell triggers memory. But no one could handle remembering clearly, so they perfumed themselves into forgetfulness. He leaned forward, voice sharpening into something almost philosophical. That's what we all do. Mask until confusion reads as cologne. Laurie intervened gently. And you, Rick? What fragrance did you settle on to live with? Rick blinked, thrown by the intimacy of the question. Whiskey. Beyond that. A longer pause followed, long enough for the room's single clock to cross 10 quiet seconds. Metal, he said finally. Not drink, not ozone. Metal like scalpels after cleaning. There's safety in sterile things. You can see your reflection even when you don't recognize it. Morty watched the edges of his grandfather's expression shimmy like film under too much light. He'd never heard him describe vulnerability in such mechanical poetry. It scared him a little, how delicate brilliance could sound when it stopped pretending. Beth broke the quiet. You used science to avoid feeling. He turned to her, no defense this time. I used science to measure it without drowning. You use words to keep yours polite. Same experiment, different lab. Laurie joined in softly. You both learned containment early. It kept you safe then and isolated now. The goal isn't demolition, it's calibration. Rick sighed. You make dysfunction sound like micro-tuning. I make survival sound adaptable, she corrected. Summer's voice slipped through next, gentle rather than sharp. You always build stuff to protect yourself, Grandpa. Maybe that's fine, but maybe people aren't supposed to come with blueprints. Rick looked at her for a long moment. Then how do you know when the structure's sound? When it still stands after being loved wrong, she said. That pulled quiet over the room again, warm, resonant, as if even the furniture needed a breath. Laurie whispered, So what did you learn from your scent experiment? Rick rubbed his temples. That truth stinks, literally. No perfume masks it forever. Eventually, the smell of what we hide bleeds through the whole house. Beth laughed unexpectedly. Not loud, but real. And yet you keep building rooms in that same house, he shrugged. Easier than moving. Morty had been silent this whole time, absorbing. Now he said quietly, Maybe the smell wasn't regret. Maybe it was everything left after you stopped running. Rick blinked, startled at the precision. Then his nod came slow, like he was agreeing with gravity. Laurie's pen finally touched paper. Thank you, Rick, he waved a hand. For what? Poor air quality. For telling the truth indirectly enough that we all recognized ourselves in it. Morty leaned back, letting the lamp's gold leak softly over his eyes. The room felt suspended. Even breathing seemed coordinated. Beth was watching Rick differently. Less accusation, more study. Jerry, hands clasped, wore empathy like a borrowed jacket that fit unexpectedly well. Summer's grin was tired but approving. Moving carefully, Laurie stood and lifted a small wooden box from the shelf. Inside were smooth pebbles of varying colors. She offered one to each of them. A stone, she said, for noticing the weight of your story without needing to drop it. Rick turned his over in his palm. Paperweights for the psyche. Exactly. It grounds your next thought, she said. He tucked it into his pocket but didn't mock further. The simple gravity of that act felt almost sacred. Laurie concluded, Homework. Observe one smell this week that tells you something true. Kitchen, a garage, a person. You'll know it when it finds you. They stood slowly, avoiding the suddenness that ends moments prematurely. Outside, night's damp breeze slid through the doorway as they left. A scent of petrichor, mint soap, and something unnameable. Rick stopped first on the step, sniffed the air like a scientist and a man at once. Smells like we might end up okay, he muttered. Morty smiled beside him. You always did have bad instruments for hope. Rick gave a half-smile that looked almost restful. They walked toward the car together, the sound of wet gravel steady underfoot, the lamp behind them flickering once before settling into patient glow. Inside the office, Laurie watched through the window. She took one quiet note in the margin of her pad. Progress often arrives disguised as humility. Then she capped her pen, breathed in the fading metallic air still humming from Rick's story, and allowed herself to feel grateful for imperfection's strange perfume. The next session came wrapped in silence, the calm kind that follows a storm already forgiven. After Rick's story about scents and bottled memories, everyone treaded carefully, as if the very air might remember what had been confessed and blush on their behalf. The house smelled faintly of wood smoke and strong coffee. Outside, autumn had begun to press down on the world in soft amber. Laurie opened the door with her usual quiet smile. The warm lamp again replaced flame, though its flicker carried memory of the candle's patience. A small canvas pouch rested on the table beside her chair, tied with cotton string. Beth noticed it first. "What's in the bag?" "A surprise," Laurie said, "but we'll wait until the end." "Some things land better after everyone's spoken," Rick murmured. "We're doing party favors now." "I didn't bring a piñata of trauma," she smiled. "No impact required today, only contact." Morty settled into his chair and felt the warmth of the cushion as an invitation. Somehow the furniture remembered softness faster each week. The brass clock, still thriving under Jerry's repair, ticked a rhythm that felt nearly confident. Laurie began. "Last week we explored the senses, how smell and memory entwine. This time we'll consider weight. The way shape and heaviness comfort us when emotions have too many edges." Rick raised an eyebrow. "Weight as in guilt, or my hangover symptoms?" "Literal weight first. We'll see where it travels." She gestured to the sheet of smooth blank paper in front of each of them. "Draw or write one thing you carry daily. Keep it simple. Don't name it obligation, show its form. What does it look like, how much does it weigh, and where do you store it?" For a long time, pencils moved in faint whispers. The room filled with the hush of effort, the rhythm of inner landscapes being translated to line. Beth's strokes were deliberate, dark. She drew what looked like a house almost collapsing, roof sagging, supported by her own shoulders drawn underneath. Summer painted color swirls that eventually created a pair of headphones spiraling outward into cloud rings. Jerry sketched a toolbox, worn but open, with a small shimmering light hiding between wrenches. Morty shaded a crude outline of a heart that seemed built from overlapping staircases. Each step looked slightly different, mismatched yet ascending. Rick drew quickly, as if chasing something before it escaped. When he finished, no one could decipher the tangled mechanical tangle he'd penned. Wires, circles, an impossible intersection of pistons and clock gears surrounding a small human silhouette in the center. Laurie looked at each paper with gentle curiosity. "These are maps," she said quietly. "They show where you keep your tenderness." Rick offered his up without irony. "Or where I keep my escapism." "They're often neighbors," she replied. She let the moment expand before pulling the canvas pouch toward her. Now for the surprise. She untied the knot delicately, releasing the soft clatter of stones. Simple, river-rounded, each one the size of a closed fist, smooth enough to catch lamplight, like miniature moons. She held them out. "These are for everyone, one stone each, not symbolic punishment," she added quickly when Rick smirked. "They're companions, unremarkable things that endure everything, weather, tide, even our neglect." Summer lifted one first, surprised by its warmth. "Hair's heavier than I thought." "They always are," Laurie said, "but feel how the roundness helps you hold the weight without harm." Beth turned hers over, tracing tiny veins of quartz inside. "It's imperfect." "So are fingerprints," Laurie pointed out. "That's how recognition works." Rick rolled his between thumb and forefinger, listening to the faint scrape it made. "So therapy rocks. Literally." "Yes," Laurie said. "I want you to keep them, put them in pockets, desks, glove compartments. Anytime silence feels heavier than words, hold it. Physical reminders outrun memory sometimes." Jerry grinned like a student finally understanding an equation. "It's grounding." "Exactly," she said, eyes bright. "When you touch it, you remind your nervous system that gravity works both for and against you, but you're still here." Morty looked up from his stone and asked softly, "Why stones?" "Because they can be thrown or kept," she said. "The choice teaches gentleness." The clock ticked behind her, one measured assurance at a time. Outside, the rain began again, a quieter drizzle receding the air. Rick flipped his stone between his hands a few times. "You recycle metaphors." "I recycle faith," Laurie replied. The group laughed, not the earlier brittle laughter that patched discomfort, but an easy, real sound. It drifted through the window screens and startled a nearby bird into song. "Let's try something," Laurie continued after the laughter faded. "Close your hands over the stones and take a single memory that hurts, but doesn't wound anymore. Then focus on the moment after, the tiny space where you realized you survived it. That place in the timeline belongs to healing." They obeyed quietly. Each person's eyes lowered, focus inward, turning visible. The office breathed through them, The hum of air conditioning, the rain against glass, the clock keeping vigil. Beth thought of the day Rick left for the first time, a portal slicing the air open like confession. Then of finding her own hands steady enough to feed 2 children that evening. Morty revisited the seconds after his own panicked mistakes years ago. The tingling clarity of still being alive afterward. Summer felt the edge of teenage loneliness soften around memory of a friend who returned. Jerry thought of repairing the clock. Rick thought of nothing, then everything, and finally settled on the taste of air inside the garage after an argument resolved by laughter. When Laurie spoke again, her voice had the hush of rain folding into sleep. Altogether, that's the sound of memory refusing to weaponize itself. The air felt cleaner somehow, tension rinsed from it like soap from skin. Summer asked, "So, are we supposed to keep it forever? As long as you choose softness over throwing," Laurie said. "Some people lose their stones when they forget what calm feels like. Others bring them back years later, smooth from use. Both are forms of success." Jerry clutched his in palm, nodding. "I'll probably talk to mine." Rick said, "It might answer better than most people." Beth smiled slightly. Still nicer conversation than some dinners used to be. Laurie let them have their humor. She knew laughter was new language for safety. When she finally ended the session, she did not close the notebook. She merely dipped her head in something like gratitude. "Homework," she said softly. "Notice the weight shift in your pocket. Embed that awareness. The world can be heavy, but you choose how to hold it." They rose slowly. Outside, twilight had washed the street in polished silver. One by one, they walked down the steps, each holding the stone differently. Beth in her sleeve pocket, Summer in her palm, Jerry juggling his absent-mindedly, Morty tucking his into the fold of his bag. Rick, last to leave, tossed his lightly into the air, caught it again and for once didn't make a joke. From the window, Laurie watched them disappear beneath street lamps flickering on. The lamp inside her office remained lit, shining against the pile of remaining stones, the few that would wait here warm through the night, ready in case anyone forgot they'd already been forgiven. A week passed before Laurie's next invitation appeared. She never called it an appointment, just sent a message that read, "If something is still echoing, bring it in." Morty stared at the text longer than necessary, feeling each word hum faintly behind his ribs. Something was echoing, though he couldn't name it. When Friday evening settled like dust on the neighborhood, he packed his stone, a sketchbook, and, almost as an afterthought, the battered spiral notebook he'd found in the garage, the one that looked suspiciously like Rick's handwriting, had tried to outthink gravity. The notebook had remained beside his desk all week, half invitation, half threat. Every night he promised he'd peek inside, and every night sleep arrived first, dragging him toward that strange, neutral peace therapy had installed. But tonight, curiosity tugged harder. Rick hadn't mentioned losing any notebook. Maybe he wanted it lost. Maybe, Morty thought, people occasionally leave evidence behind for someone gentler to study. When he arrived, Laurie's window light spilled warm rectangles across the wet pavement, calling like dusk's small lantern. Inside, the others were already gathered. Beth sat cross-armed but relaxed. Jerry fiddled with an extra stone he'd borrowed for symmetry. Summer drew circles on the condensation of her water glass, and Rick leaned back, coat collar, raised, staring at the ceiling as if the plaster were giving a lecture. Laurie greeted them with her steady calm. "Tonight requires something you keep hidden," she said. "It can be an object, memory, or thought you're brave enough to consider explaining." Morty hesitated, then raised the nearly disintegrating spiral. "I found this. I think it's, Grandpa's." Rick's eyes landed on it like magnets meeting an old compass. "Where did you—" "The garage shelf, between boxes labeled misc parts and better worlds. It looked important." Rick exhaled, half-groan, half-sigh. "Ah, the field journal that outlived usefulness," Laurie gestured. "Would he like to share what's inside?" Rick waved a dismissive hand. "Just my half-finished equations and regret doodles. Not bedtime reading." "But the title," Morty said, "says A Study in Staying." Everyone turned to Rick. He blinked. "Well, so much for subtle titles." Beth leaned forward. "That doesn't sound like equations." "It was supposed to quantify contentment," Rick said, shifting uncomfortably. "I thought if I charted variables, Time spent here, laughter frequency, percentage of arguments per hour. I could reverse engineer peace. Turns out there's no formula for not being haunted. Laurie nodded, not pitying, just understanding. May we look? She asked Morty. He opened the notebook carefully, as if its binding could bruise. The first few pages were dotted with graphs that made no sense, axes labeled difference, distance, decibel. Then came fragments of sentences crowding one another, until some broke off mid-thought. Happiness constant remains elusive, possible interference from memory noise. Equation requires compassion coefficient. 1. Impossible without external agent. Then the handwriting softened, letters looping wider. Sketches replaced data, an outline of the Smith family dinner table, a cartoon of Rick asleep with a wrench still in hand, a starry sky drawn entirely in blue ink dots. Morty felt his throat tighten. He handed it to Laurie, who read quietly, then said, "Sometimes writing begins as control and ends as confession." Rick smirked, though his eyes were elsewhere. "Sometimes building equations is safer than building apologies." Laurie turned another page. At the top, a single line stretched across. "If they ever find this, let them know it wasn't avoidance. It was measurement in human units I couldn't yet name." The room dimmed quietly. Even the clock softened its tick. Beth whispered, "You were studying us." "No," Rick said. "I was studying why you stayed without me deserving it." Summer blinked at him. "That's shockingly sweet and scientifically tragic." Rick shrugged. "It's what I had." Laurie closed the notebook and set it down between them like sacred pottery. This is the old language of care, the one left behind by people who don't yet know it's love. Morty folded his hands around the stone in his pocket, the texture grounding him. For some reason, he thought of the cranes from Beth's dream, tiny paper survivors needing only belief to hover. Laurie asked, "Rick, what would you say to your past self who started this notebook?" He considered, eyes half on the window where night was gathering. "I'd tell him you can't measure forgiveness while you're busy proving despair useful. And maybe write smaller. Nice penmanship never saved anyone." They chuckled softly. Laurie turned to Morty. "And you? What compels you to bring this today?" "I think—" He hesitated. "It wanted to be found, like it kept the part of him that still learns." Rick looked up at that, mouth tipping towards something dangerously close to gratitude. "Careful, kid. Respecting a scientist's failed experiment counts as emotional plagiarism." "Then I'll co-author," Morty said. Beth reached over, brushing the notebook's frayed corner. "I wish I'd known he was trying this whole time," Rick replied quietly. "You did. You just didn't call it science." Laurie smiled at that symmetry but didn't disturb it. Her voice lowered. "The notebook can stay here for safekeeping, until the experiment feels complete." Rick nodded slowly. It might like the company. They sat without speaking, 5 silhouettes gathered around a tattered record of imperfect genius. Outside, traffic passed at its usual unhurried pace. The sound came muffled through rain-damp glass, merging with breath and heartbeat until everything inside the room pulsed in one calm meter. Laurie ended with her favorite phrase. The one they all understood now carried weight beyond ritual. "Remember, silence isn't absence. It's data waiting to become comfort." When they rose, Morty offered the notebook back to Rick. "You should keep it." Rick shook his head. "Leave it with her. Therapy's better storage than my garage." He placed his hand gently on the spiral, palm flat, as if calibrating memory one last time. For a long second, nobody moved. Finally, he muttered, "You can tell my data its hypothesis was wrong." "What was the hypothesis?" Jerry asked. "That love decays faster than math," Laurie spoke softly. "And the conclusion?" Rick met her gaze. "Turns out love violates entropy." Outside, dusk deepened into a velvet quiet. The stray light from the window spread across the lampposts, washing the street in gold haze. They left one by one, each brushing fingertips against the table's edge, as if collecting static warmth for later. The notebook remained small and tired, pages slightly curled from breath. The lamp shone over it long after they'd gone, illuminating blue ink constellations that seemed to shift faintly in the heat, rearranging themselves into something whole, proof that even scribbled equations grow comfortable once the scientist finally sleeps. That night the weather slipped, entirely into winter's rehearsal, cold air wearing, the faint perfume of snow yet to fall. Laurie had replaced her usual lamp with 3 candles set low on the round table, each one tilted a little, like companions leaning in to listen. The faint hiss of their wax-soft breathing filled the corners, that small sound of constancy most people miss. They gathered without the usual shuffle of voices. From the first silence onward, there was a sense that something might be whispered tonight instead of spoken. The golden light washed their faces evenly. Everyone looked briefly younger, as though time had loosened its grip in the presence of flame. Laurie greeted them by a nod alone and motioned to the circle of chairs. "We'll keep this one simple," she said softly. "When words grow tired, light can translate for us." Morty felt the air against his skin change temperature with every flicker. It seemed to write invisible equations across the floor. Jerry rubbed his palms together for warmth. Beth tucked her hair behind one ear so she could stare straight into the slow dance of wicks. Summer pulled her knees up into her chair, small smile holding at her lips. Rick leaned back, coat collar still up, the shadows of flame tracing his wrinkles into maps. Laurie continued, "When electricity goes out, people tell stories. Not because they have to, but because darkness requests them. If the candles were the listeners tonight, what story would you want them to hear?" Her words floated down like dust through sunlight. None of them answered immediately. The clock hesitated with them, the tick thinning almost to nothing. Jerry surprised everyone by speaking first. "I'd tell them about when Beth was born," he said. I fainted before the doctor even walked in. When I woke up, she was already in my arms. It felt like the universe forgave everything I hadn't yet broken. Beth blinked quickly. Her voice came steadier than her eyes. "I didn't know that part." "You were busy crying," he said with a sideways grin. "Loudest baby alive." The group's quiet laughter wandered through the room like soft wind beneath doors. Rick exhaled long, as though releasing amusement and ache together. "They make it sound easy, DNA exchange and biological miracles, but yeah, it changes the math," he murmured. "You start calculating life in hugs instead of equations." Laurie's face stayed luminous in the ripple of candlelight. "There's courage in telling bright stories about times when everything was shadow." She passed small slips of paper to each of them. "Write one compliment about someone in this room, a sentence that will survive if power goes out again later." Morty stared at the blank strip, suddenly aware of how heavy kindness feels before written. His pencil trembled slightly, heartbeat audible inside fingertips. Nearby, Rick had already begun scribbling. The sound of graphite was steady as rainfall. 5 minutes passed in deliberate quiet. The only voice in the room belonged to wax, a slow hiss that pronounced acceptance. Laurie extended a small bowl to collect their folded notes. "No names. I'll read them aloud so they belong to everyone." She unfolded the first slip. "You make cynicism look temporary." Eyes flicked toward Rick. He pretended to cough. Another. "You show up even when you'd rather evaporate." Beth smiled crookedly. Third. "You repair silence by listening." Laurie paused, visibly touched. "That's beautiful." Next. "You taught me that sarcasm can cradle instead of cut." Summer laughed. "Okay, that one's definitely Grandpa." Rick shrugged. "Control group hypothesis confirmed." The last note read, "Your presence keeps the air measurable." They all looked first at Laurie, then at Morty, whose blush betrayed authorship. "I meant everyone," he stammered. "But yeah, maybe mostly her." Laurie closed her eyes briefly, taking the words as medicine rather than praise. When she opened them, her expression carried that familiar kindness that made everyone believe recovery was an ordinary verb. "Thank you," she whispered. "Complimenting is actually a scientific act. It alters chemical balances faster than most drugs." Rick raised an eyebrow. "So kindness is narcotic now?" "Non-habit forming," she said, smiling. "Though I wouldn't discourage addiction." The room warmed fractionally. Each candle bent into its neighbor's draft, flames learning companionship through motion. The rhythm of light and shadow flicked like slow breathing across every cheek. Laurie spoke again, even quieter. "We've talked about endurance, repair, scent, weight, and honesty. Now we speak about illumination, the kind that doesn't demand attention, just gives it." Summer, watching the candle nearest her tilt, reached out instinctively to catch the drip of wax before it reached the table. She held her finger to the droplet, letting it cool. surprised at how it hardened into shape between skin and air. "One accident becomes texture," she whispered. "Kind of like us." "Exactly," Laurie said. "Light teaches patience by vanishing slowly." Beth exhaled, eyes still on flame. "When Mom left, I used to keep candles like these. I'd count how long they lasted. It felt like proof that something could stay constant even while melting away." Rick nodded. "I remember finding half-burnt tapers all over the old kitchen. Thought we had a ghost obsessed with ambience. That was me. It smelled like safety." He didn't answer, but his silence bent toward apology in the same way wax leans toward fire. A wind brushed the edges of the building. The candles trembled but recovered, wicks straightening again, determined. When the light steadied, everyone noticed it at once. "They just shivered with us," Morty said. "Candles that answer back." "Because calm multiplies," Laurie replied. "When one steadies, the rest follow." For a long moment, no one spoke. The gentle hiss of burning replaced language. Each family member looked into a different flame, yet somehow watched the same story. One of resilience crawling upward through heat, bright and tender. Finally, Laurie whispered the session's closure. "Tonight, take light home in your minds. It doesn't have to shine. It can rest like embers remembering." Rick blew out the first candle. The tiny thread of smoke spiraled upward, twisting like laughter not ready to die. Beth cupped her hand to the second flame and exhaled, gone. Morty handled the third, a quiet puff sending warmth across his wrist. Darkness filled the room but refused menace. It settled like velvet assurance. In the dim, Laurie's voice lingered, soft and absolute. "There, even absent, it glows." They left without switching on overhead lights. The hallway shimmered with half-reflections from rain outside. Street lamps puddled gold across the floor, so they walked through pieces of evening turned fluid. At the parking lot, Morty glanced back through Laurie's window. Somehow, though he knew every candle was extinguished, he could still see faint outlines of flame hovering behind the glass, memory performing its quiet encore. He smiled and whispered to the night, "They really do answer back." Rick, following his gaze, stuffed his hands into his pockets. "Good. Saves me from inventing another way to measure warmth." They stood there for a while, watching invisible fire shine through fog, realizing maybe absence itself was just light's gentlest way of staying. The first truly cold week of the year arrived with endless grey. Streetlights stayed on through morning, unwilling to compete with that pale kind of daylight that looked half awake. The therapy room felt smaller than usual, walls wrapped in wool light, steam breathing faintly from everyone's cups. For the first time since they'd begun, Rick hadn't made a joke at the door. He just nodded to Laurie and sat down, eyes ringed in the color of tired metal. Laurie studied the group for a moment, then asked, "What sound has been following you lately?" Beth thought of dishes clinking, Jerry of the too loud kettle. Morty almost said wind. Before anyone could answer aloud, Summer spoke, voice trimmed of irony but sharp with something guided, something ready. "I can't tell anymore if noise means life or just distraction," she said. Laurie turned toward her. "Stay there a second." "What kind of noise?" Summer's gaze dropped to her lap. All of it. People. Songs coming from every possible direction. Even silence feels like static lately. I keep wearing headphones to sleep. No music, just the hum, because quiet's too close to space. Rick tilted his head, thoughtful. "Space has plenty of sound, kid. You just have to know which frequency of emptiness to tune to." "Exactly," she breathed. "And that's the problem. Everyone fills it. I want to know what love sounds like without commercials." Her words doused conversation. The old clock ticked obediently but small, as if reluctant to interrupt. Beth reached over, resting her palm on Summer's arm. "Is that why you always have your earbuds in?" "Maybe. Noise is safer than waiting for the next argument." Morty looked at her, surprised at the accuracy of how loneliness could dress itself. "You don't need music to prove you exist, you know," he said. "I know," she answered, "but silence feels like being forgotten on purpose." Rick rubbed his temple. "When the universe stops yelling, most people panic. Because if the shouting ends, you're left with your own head." "It's the loudest room there is," Laurie said softly. "Good. Let's talk about that room. What lives there?" Summer shrugged. "Questions with volume knobs. Memories that don't turn off when I want to sleep. And tiny compliments I heard once but didn't keep long enough." Her voice thinned near the edge of words. "I just want everything's volume to match how much I miss people." No one responded. They didn't need to. The truth had weight. It settled into the cushions beside everybody, warm like a second body. Laurie broke the silence gently. When you were younger, Summer, what sound meant you were safe? The refrigerator, she said immediately. Everyone smiled. The answer was perfect. Its hum was steady. It meant we still had food, power, normal things. Jerry nodded. That hum kept me sane, too. The only appliance with emotional stability. Beth laughed through her nose. Add that to our list of family members. Rick raised his mug. To the appliance that stayed on through galaxy collapses. They all chuckled. The tone had shifted. A polite rescue party carrying humor and love in matching flashlights. Laurie watched, content, then said quietly, "Noise becomes comfort when it teaches rhythm instead of interruption." Maybe that's why machines sound like lullabies if you let them. Then why do people sound like alarms? Summer asked. That's the miracle of emotion, Laurie answered. It forgets moderation. The words clicked into the room's gentle machinery. The heater sighed through its vents. Outside, wind unrolled its constant white roar, navigating branches and distance with the soft arrogance of those who never run out of breath. Morty said, almost to himself, I used to think silence meant punishment. But after all this, it kind of sounds like trust. Exactly, Laurie said. True quiet is simply noise that knows when to rest. Rick leaned forward now. Have you ever noticed in the middle of the chaos, there's a single frequency that cuts through everything? The one nobody listens for because it's softer than air. Summer blinked. What is it? It's you breathing, he said. The only soundtrack you never turn off. That stunned her into stillness. She whispered, maybe that's what I was really afraid to hear. Beth took her hand. The faint grip exchanged understanding that didn't need phrasing. Laurie reached for her notebook but didn't write. She simply spoke into the hush. If life insists on being loud, then listening is rebellion. Try indexing your sounds. Find one that doesn't drain you. Summer smiled finally. You mean like a playlist for being okay? If that helps, said Laurie. Start with things that hum out of habit. Rain, wind, old clocks, coffee machines, the fridge. They know what endurance sounds like. Jerry, suddenly inspired, said, I'll record the refrigerator tonight. Rick smirked. Finally, Art, I understand. Call it domestic frequency. I'd buy the vinyl. Laughter threaded through them again, short but sustaining. Laurie lowered her voice as the heater clicked off, leaving pure air. Let's try something, she whispered. Close your eyes, the room obeyed. The absence of sight amplified everything. The slowing of 5 distinct breaths, fabrics whispering under small movements, the quiet pulse of candle fumes turning to faint smoke. For nearly a minute they listened to each other exist. Then Laurie said, Right there, that was music. Ordinary breathing arranged by kindness. The clock resumed ticking louder now, confident again. Summer opened her eyes. It wasn't silent at all, she said. It was everything waiting to be loved at normal volume. Laurie nodded, her smile carrying the slow grace of dusk. Then you found your instrument. Rick reached into his pocket and pulled the stone Laurie had given them 2 weeks before, rolling it between fingers. It made a soft scrape, friction humming faintly. Even rocks make sound if you listen. Maybe that's why geologists live long, he said. You can hear the earth sigh. Summer teased. Only when it's disappointed, they all laughed. The sound bled into the thin edge of twilight, like sugar into tea. Laurie poured new cups for everyone, steam curling up in unison with their quieter energy. The session had melted tension into something mild, tangible only as tired peace. As they prepared to leave, Laurie said, Remember, not every volume knob belongs to the world. You're allowed to turn yourself down gently. Outside, wind chased stray leaves into tiny spirals, singing a tune made entirely of movement. Walking to the car, Summer paused near the porch light and listened. She heard water rushing through far gutters, the clack of Rick's boots behind her, the rhythmic squeak of Beth's umbrella hinge. Layered together, it resembled the heartbeat of some enormous, complicated kindness. Rick reached the car first. You hearing ghosts, kid? No, she said, smiling. I think I'm hearing home at a manageable volume. He tilted his head, approving. Good frequency. As they drove away, raindrops began again, light, consistent, perfectly timed. Inside the dark office they'd just left, Laurie stood by the window a moment longer, listening to the leftover resonance of their laughter fading into the wet air. It sounded exactly like Hope practicing to stay in tune. The house had long since gone to sleep. Outside, winter balanced on its edge, holding back snow with the slow discipline of a prelude. The quiet was so thick that the smallest noises sounded immense. The refrigerator sighing, pipes muttering their half-dreams, the wind rehearsing an argument down the chimney. Beth couldn't rest. She had tried tea, dark rooms, open windows, closed books. Sleep refused her like a polite stranger declining a dance. She found herself lured by that strange impulse to move when everything else has stopped moving. Barefoot and careful, she stepped into her coat and left the house, crossing the backyard in a hush broken only by frost crackling under toes. Light from the porch traced the familiar shape of her breath. In its halo, cold air glittered with the same dust of memory that filled Laurie's office every week. Visible evidence of the unseen. From the sliding door, she could see Rick's old garage. The door was open a fraction, enough for lamplight to bleed through like a secret keeping itself honest. She entered, half expecting chaos, half comforted by it, but the space was tidy, tidier than she remembered. Shelves squared themselves obediently, papers stacked according to a system that might almost qualify as ordinary. Only one thing stood out, the empty place on the workbench where a spiral notebook used to live. She knew what it was. She knew Morty had brought it to therapy last week. She'd watched Rick's face soften around memory then. That night his silence had held the weight of a scientist's seeding proof. She closed the garage door gently behind her. The air smelled like the oldest parts of herself. Dust, metal, ink. Her breath echoed back, faintly amplified by walls that once hummed with invention. Tonight it carried no machinery, only her. She breathed that emptiness until it felt friendly. On the shelf beside the workbench lay a scattering of folded paper, scraps Rick must have used to test equations or balance gears. One piece was folded more carefully than the rest, a paper crane, small and exact. She smiled. It was the same model he'd folded in her dream weeks ago, the same impossible stillness trapped in corners. She lifted it. The paper rustled like thin leaves. For a moment she almost imagined it might move, with an inhale, a flutter. Of course it didn't, but the hope itself startled her with its familiarity. She placed it on the bench, wings spread as if absorbing lamplight, and whispered, "You remember me better than he does." Across the room, something shifted, the faintest creak of a chair, the groan of Rick's memory sitting down again. She laughed softly to herself. "All right, Dad, you win. You built another time machine. This one works backward only inside me." The sound steadied the air. She noticed the mechanical clock Rick had once used to test relativity, its pendulum swinging slow, like an old lullaby's heartbeat. Watching it, her grip on regret eased a fraction, each swing saying, still here, finally she went back inside. The house met her with its layered stillness, the breathing of sleeping family, the faint whine of heating pipes remembering warmth. She passed their rooms, the door to Summer's half open, soft blue phone light on the ceiling, Morty's quiet except for the thump of music leaking from his dreams. Beth smiled into the noise and felt gratitude like a blanket near the edges of warmth. She ended in the dining room. On the table sat an unused candle from Laurie's last session. She struck a match. The flare startled the shadows into running away. Flame caught, small but urgent, painting the tablecloth gold. She dropped into a chair and opened the small notebook she kept, for things she never managed to say aloud. At the top of a new page in slow handwriting she wrote, "To whoever raised me," she paused. The phrase already carried too many meanings. She set the pen down, exhaled, and began again beneath it. "Thank you for the mornings that stayed, for teaching me that light without apology can still enter a room where science failed and kindness needed proof. You were mostly noise, but sometimes music. You left, but you left the stars mapped clearly enough for me to travel back when I had to. I understand it now, the way you made love a study instead of a gesture. That used to anger me. Tonight it hums like comprehension. I wanted simple answers. You built complex rooms. I live in them still, and I've stopped trying to escape." She looked at what she'd written, surprised at how the words looked less sharp than they felt leaving her. Candles have ways of forgiving handwriting. Wax pooled beside the page, forming small white mirrors of flame. She wrote one more line, still trying, that looked right. Honest, unfinished, the pure language of progress. She closed the book, slid it under the candle holder to catch the wax drips. Anne sat there while the world continued its slow turning. Through the window she could see the porch light, a steady star above the deck. She wondered if Rick left it on or forgot again. Maybe neither. Maybe knowing a light waits is enough reason to let darkness take its time. Footsteps approached. Jerry's, sleepy and uncertain. "Beth, everything okay?" She smiled without turning. "Yeah, just thinking." He hesitated, then wrapped a blanket from the couch around her shoulders, careful not to knock the candle. "Don't stay up too late," he murmured, then kissed her hair and disappeared back down the hallway. She watched the candle ease toward its own ending. When the wick bent, collapsing into a small hiss of smoke, she whispered, "Good night, Dad." The upward coil of smoke carried the words across the quiet ceiling, into all the unspoken atmospheres of forgiveness. Outside, frost formed delicate sequins on the grass. The door between house and night held a thin line of gold where the porch light met her shadow. In that hour between yesterday's ache and tomorrow's attempt, Beth felt something small and certain lift, the emotional version of a paper crane catching a gentle draft. She smiled into the darkness, certain she didn't need sleep to dream. Morning reached the city lazily, spreading through fog like a hand feeling its way across an unfamiliar face. In Laurie's office, the light arrived first, modest and grey, slipping between half-closed blinds, before brushing the table and the circle of chairs. The chairs waited like instruments mid-tune. The soundless clock pressed its rhythm into the walls. Tick, pause, try again. By 7 o'clock, all 4 Smiths were there. The 5th chair, Rick's, rested crooked and empty, angled as always away from the window. It looked lonelier without defiance inside it. Laurie glanced once toward the door, then at her watch. "Well," she said softly, "today the universe has given us an experiment. What happens when someone doesn't show?" Beth's hands tightened around her mug. "He's done this before," she muttered. Silence is his favorite kind of speech. Summer pretended to check her phone, then set it face down. Maybe he overslept. Or time-traveled into therapy avoidance. Jerry's shoulders curved. He could still come. He usually enters like thunder after we've all confessed something meaningful. Morty said nothing. He kept watching the door as if staring might bend reality's schedule. Laurie noticed and smiled softly. "You're worried for him, Morty?" The boy nodded. "Kind of, also not. I guess I just thought he'd outgrow vanishing." Laurie folded her hands. "Sometimes absence arrives to teach presence its weight. Let's use the space he left. He has a way of turning empty air into opportunity." Beth snorted. "He'd like that. Chaos rebranded as a life lesson." Laurie said, "Then let's try it his way." She stood and walked to the center of the circle, where sunlight now drew a pale coin on the carpet. If he were here, what would he interrupt first? Almost in one breath, they answered, "Me." Laurie laughed quietly, surprised pleasure in the sound. "Then let him interrupt no one. You'll fill that seat yourselves today." The 4 exchanged glances. Jerry nudged the chair slightly, as though preparing it for its invisible guest. Morty leaned forward. "So, what do we actually do?" Laurie looked up at the ceiling, mimicking Rick's tone. "We speak to the hum. Ask questions that don't want answers." Summer smirked. "That's suspiciously poetic for a guy who labels dreams under chemical waste." "Exactly," Laurie said. "Let's begin with that contradiction. What would you tell him while he's missing that you can't say when he's here?" Beth's voice arrived first, low but steady. "I used to think you only loved the versions of us that impressed you. I'm realizing maybe you were just scared to admit you loved us regardless," Jerry added. "I'd tell him he makes hopelessness seem almost noble." Summer rolled her eyes kindly. "You'd compliment him for despair, Dad?" "It's the only thing he accepts praise for," Jerry replied. They laughed. The sound anchored the air again. Laurie wrote a single line in her notebook. "Absence generates wit. Defense that sounds like grace." She spoke next, voice softer. "You know, I did receive a note." They looked up in unison. She held out a folded page. "This was under my door this morning. It says simply, 'Today's experiment. Test what happens if I let them speak without interruption.' It's in his handwriting." Morty almost smiled. "That's so him," Beth sighed. "He skipped therapy responsibly." Laurie unfolded the paper completely and smoothed it on her knee. "He's listening even when he's elsewhere." That's what this means. For a moment none of them spoke. Rain started again outside, polite tapping. Rain that didn't want to intrude. Laurie said, "Let's honor the experiment. Tell me what happens when no one fills his silence but you." Morty inhaled. "It feels bigger than I thought," Summer whispered. "Like a room just learned to breathe inward." Beth nodded. "Like we've been waiting for this quiet, scared of it but wanting it." Jerry rubbed his chin. "It's oddly peaceful. I keep expecting an explosion of genius or guilt, but I just hear rain." Laurie smiled. Hearing rain is a breakthrough. They sat another minute. Their breathing synced again. The clock reclaimed attention. Laurie said, "Let's imagine him walking in right now hearing what you just said." "What would he do?" Summer grinned faintly. "Pretend to yawn? Say we're sentimental data sets." "Then maybe," Laurie answered, "he'd add that sentimental data is statistically significant." Beth chuckled lightly. I can almost hear him correcting her syntax. Rick's chair rocked slightly under some draft, creaking once enough to make everyone pause. Jerry blinked. "Did anyone else?" Morty smiled. "Guess the experiment's running both ways." Laurie didn't look surprised. "Energy completes its own circuits when acknowledged," she said. "Let's close today by giving that chair what we'd give him if he were in it." They hesitated, but Morty began first. "Thanks for at least trying." Beth folded her arms and said, "Next time show up for real so I can argue properly." Jerry offered, "I forgive you for the toaster incident, mostly." Summer added, "And for pretending sarcasm was a parenting style." Laurie waited a beat, then whispered toward the empty seat, "Well done." "Scientist." The chair stopped creaking. Sunlight slid from its corner. Morty swallowed the lump rising in his throat. He found it strange that a missing person could fill a room so completely. Laurie spoke once more. "Sometimes people teach best by absence." Silence was his final hypothesis today. You just proved it's survivable. They gathered their things. No rush, just quiet movement. Zippers, paper, the shuffle of coats meeting September air again. At the doorway, Beth looked back. "It almost feels like he left his skin in that chair." "Or his patience," Summer said. Outside, the air smelled newly clean. The drizzle had settled into a mist that kissed every surface evenly. They stood under the awning for a while, listening. Far away inside the building, a faint, metallic echo, the sound of Rick's wrench rolling off a shelf somewhere in his imagined absence, made them all turn instinctively, smiling like conspirators finally in on the joke. Morty whispered, "Maybe that was the experiment ending." Beth touched his shoulder. "Or starting." Laurie locked the office behind them, slipping Rick's note into her coat pocket. She would file it later between the pages of his old notebook. It belonged with other proofs that growth can write itself into existence without witnesses. When she turned off the hall lights, the reflection from the window showed 5 silhouettes instead of 4. The 5th leaned toward the others, almost merging with them, science briefly surrendering to symmetry. The following week smelled like thawing snow, clean. Unsure, the tiny scent of new beginnings wrapped inside cold air. Spring was still a rumor, but sunlight arrived earlier that morning, pretending to forget the past months of rain. Laurie's window caught that light. It fell across the carpet in pale rectangles, warming the circle of chairs where once again the Smith family gathered, a constellation almost routine now. Rick was back. He walked in first, no apology offered, only a quiet "miss me," uttered with the softness of someone testing gravity after landing. Laurie smiled as if she'd been expecting precisely those 2 words. Summer answered before anyone else could. Only during the boring parts. He winked at her in mock offense. Beth followed, coat slung over her arm. Jerry and Morty came last, carrying laughter that didn't need a source. Just a willingness to exist. Laurie waited until everyone sat, folded her hands on her knees and said, "Today I'd like to talk about joy." Rick groaned. "Finally, the dangerous stuff." "Exactly," she said. "Most people are more frightened of joy than grief. Grief has instructions. Joy asks for surrender." Morty tilted his head. "You can manualize sadness, you mean?" Rick muttered. "Society's been doing it for centuries. Step 1, cry. Step 2, apologize for crying. Step 3, blog about it." The group chuckled faintly. Laurie continued, "So to practice surrender, I want each of you to tell a story that made you laugh. Not polite laughter, the kind that hits in the middle of sadness and blindsides you." The notion rolled around the room like a small marble of permission. Summer smirked immediately. Whenever Grandpa's portal gun jams, and he swears in alien languages that sound like opera. Rick raised an eyebrow. Composer's dead, I was honoring him. Beth's turn came next. Once at my clinic, a horse tried to eat my clipboard. I had a meltdown, then laughed until I nearly fell over. It's impossible to stay broken when you're being judged by a horse with good taste in paperwork. Jerry, who had been fiddling with his wedding ring like it might spark inspiration, cleared his throat. Mine's short, he began. I laughed this morning, at a joke I told myself once, years ago. Laurie leaned forward slightly. Would you share it with us now? Jerry hesitated, eyes bouncing between family faces like a comedian testing audience warmth. It's not good, he warned. I'm no scientist of humor. Beth smiled knowingly. So that makes you the control group, he grinned. Exactly. He took a dramatic pause, theatrical enough that even Rick didn't ruin it. So, Jerry said, this morning I was fixing the handle on the fridge again, and I told myself, if stability's what you crave, keep holding on. Then I realized I was literally holding on to a handle, stabilizing the stability. So I started laughing, really laughing. Because that's exactly my life, repairing something that only reminds me to let go. They all stared for a second, then burst out simultaneously, laughing not at the joke but at the way he sold it. That blend of hope and self-deprecation that only Jerry could balance. Even Laurie's usual calm cracked open to amusement. The laugh gathered like small applause around the circle, calling warmth into every rigid corner left in them. Rick wiped his eyes, pretending disbelief. Congratulations, he said. You weaponized irony into enlightenment. Jerry shrugged, the tiniest hint of pride on his face. Second chances come disguised as punchlines sometimes, Laurie nodded. That's exactly it. Humor is the brain's version of forgiveness, recognizing a mistake and choosing melody instead of alarm. Beth touched Jerry's knee affectionately. Keep telling that one. It might finally make therapy redundant. He smiled at the contact. For once, no stammer escaped. Only quiet satisfaction found its seat inside him. Laurie let laughter fade organically before she spoke again. Joy isn't fragile, she said almost to herself. It's the spine of resilience. You've all spent months studying pain. Today you remembered Levity's equation. Morty lifted his head. So the new assignments? To laugh more? To allow it, she answered. Laughter doesn't need improvement plans. Rick sipped the mug she'd set at his elbow. And when laughter fails? Then smile at its attempt, Laurie said. Failure's part of belonging. Each of them absorbed the words differently. Summer scrawled something on her palm with a pen, perhaps a reminder to breathe between sarcasms. Beth gazed towards sunlight, catching the glass rim of the water jug, refracting rainbows across the wall. Jerry closed his eyes fully, still half smiling. Morty leaned back until chair legs squeaked, body releasing its alertness. Rick was the one who broke the hush. Know what's hilarious? He said softly. I keep running from family disasters, only to end up scheduling them. Beth laughed outright. Summer snorted. Morty covered his face. Jerry pointed a victorious finger. That's material. See, you've got stand-up potential. Laurie chuckled. Therapy is open mic night. I'd buy tickets. The room held that buoyancy for several minutes. It glowed, not from the lamp, but from simple unity. A brightness that didn't need explanation. For the first time, nobody looked at the clock. Time kept its own joke running quietly behind them, amused at being forgotten. When the laughter finally dissolved into gentle breathing, Laurie said, Let's seal this moment. Everyone name one thing you forgive yourself for. No reasoning, no backstory, just release it out loud. Beth. For confusing control with care, Jerry. For holding on too tightly to fridge handles and people, Summer. For pretending calm means apathy, Morty. For blaming myself for other people storms. Rick waited last, considering. He glanced around the circle, eyes softer than whiskey but equally aged. For existing louder than I meant to. No one answered. They didn't need to. Forgiveness settled over the room as neutral as dust, coating everything gently. Laurie exhaled through a smile. That's enough work for Joy's debut. They lingered afterward. Simple conversation about coffee brands and cold weather. Small talk that felt sudden and sacred. When they finally left, Laurie stood at the window again and watched them cross the street. 5 shadows with one shared warmth between them. Jerry was still talking, gesturing animatedly. Every few seconds the others laughed. Across the street, Rick turned toward the half-hidden moon and saluted with his mug. "Second chance jokes," he murmured. "Better therapy than science." Inside, Laurie blew out the lamp's bulb, which had burned non-stop since afternoon. As darkness filled the room, the echo of their laughter remained, faint but undeniable, circling once beneath the ceiling before settling into the fibers of carpet like pollen, the small residue. Every honest joy leaves behind the air the following week carried that rare scent of clean sky, everything. Rinsed blue again after too many grey months. Laurie had cracked one of the tall windows to invite it in. The curtains moved like slow breath. On the table, the usual mug, the small notebook, the single unlit candle, familiar props in a ritual that now felt more like family dinner than analysis. Rick walked in first, carrying a thermos and 2 paper cups. "Kettle broke," he said, setting them down. "I made tea." "Don't test it. Just believe in it," Laurie smiled. "That's all any of us ever do here." Beth, Summer, Morty, and Jerry followed, their coats carrying traces of the outside chill. They arranged themselves automatically, the way certain flocks don't need instruction once migration becomes instinct. Laurie waited until the chairs stopped creaking. "Tonight," she said, "you won't have homework or drawing, just tea." Rick requested minimal activity, and for once minimal sounds like medicine. Morty looked at his grandfather's hands, noticing how even still they trembled slightly near steadiness. Rick poured tea for each of them, dark amber liquid that smelled good but defied classification. He didn't sit until everyone had a cup. Beth raised an eyebrow. "What's this, a peace offering?" "More like a science experiment disguised as politeness," Rick muttered. Laurie nodded toward him. "Then begin the experiment for us." Rick inhaled slowly, exhaled slower. When he finally spoke, the sound lacked the usual edges. "I know you people keep expecting apologies, and I keep forgetting how those work. So think of this tea as a low-risk prototype for accountability. Hot enough to remember, harmless enough to fail." Beth's mouth twitched between a smile and a sigh. "Only you could rename remorse." "That's what linguistics is for," he said. "I'm better at brewing than begging." Summer cupped the mug in both hands. "So we're drinking your apology." Rick shrugged, hydrating guilt into community service. They laughed, a soft ripple that filled what didn't need explanation. Laurie waited until quiet returned. "Go on," she said. "What do you want them to know without the word sorry attached?" Rick stared at the steam seeping upward. "That I remember the noise more than the words. Yelling goodbyes machinery. All of it blends. What cuts through is how you stayed anyway." Beth lowered her eyes. "You could have said that years ago." "I didn't have tea then," she almost laughed, then didn't. Her face softened instead, a kind of grace disguised as exhaustion. Laurie leaned forward slightly. "So if this is an act instead of an apology, what is it meant to repair?" "The clock," Rick said. Everyone turned, confused. He pointed to the brass timepiece Jerry had fixed months earlier. "It's been ticking too fast lately. Gravity shift from all the emotional revelations, probably. I thought slowing things down might help." Morty blinked. "You made time tea?" Rick grinned faintly. "Just tea, kid." "But for a minute, if everyone sits still, it does the same job." Silence followed. Obedient, peaceful, almost worshipful. Only the faint clink of mugs disturbed it. They drank. The tea was terrible, of course, bitter with something herbal no one recognized, but it worked. Heat spread through them, equalizing heartbeat and breath until conversation no longer felt required. Laurie watched their faces in sequence, the way Summer's shoulders dropped, how Beth's spine unwound, Jerry's fingers stopped fidgeting. Morty's eyes lowered into soft interest. Rick, oddly, looked the calmest of all, the man who'd lived entire lives avoiding calm. He cleared his throat. "This isn't about regret. Regret's overpriced. It's about small course corrections. Tea instead of disappearance. Presence instead of perfection." He waved a hand. "See, cheap gestures, but they accumulate." Beth said quietly. "Still counts." "Don't quantify nostalgia," he said. But his voice carried something like gratitude. Laurie tapped her notebook with the end of her pen, but didn't write. "You've just illustrated the difference between an apology and atonement," she said. "Apologies are noise. Atonement is structure. The tea is the structure." Rick looked relieved. Good. Structure's my mother tongue. They all drank again as if to seal the thought. Through the open window drifted faint city sounds. An ambulance far off, laughter from passers-by, a train horn that could belong to any timeline. Noise without intrusion, Morty spoke into that air. Grandpa, if this is your version of sorry, it's not half bad, Rick smirked. Half's an upgrade, Laurie said. Maybe that's our lesson tonight. Half good is still progress. Summer lifted her mug like a toast. 2 functional fractions. They clinked cups, laughing again, this time without nervousness. The walls seemed to take the vibration and hum it back, approval shaped as acoustics. When the laughter dwindled, Beth traced her finger around the rim of her mug. I think you've been apologizing in code for years, she said to Rick. Repairing things, fixing clocks, pouring bad tea. We just didn't speak the language, he nodded. Takes a good translator. His eyes flicked toward Laurie. She accepted the compliment by breathing in quietly. The therapist's kind of smile, that mix of pride and humility that meant keep going without me. Jerry stood to refill the kettle. No one stopped him. Routine had become comfort and they let him perform it. Steam plumed up again, blurring the window, a soft lens over the room's collective hush. Laurie asked, Before we finish, what does forgiveness feel like right now, in this exact minute? Beth said, warm. Morty said, smells like mint and metal and... Thus? Summer said, heavy in the good way. Jerry said, refillable. Rick took the longest. Everyone waited. Finally he said, boring, and that's perfect. Because peace should never need fireworks. Laurie leaned back, satisfied. Then the experiment worked. As they prepared to leave, Rick gathered the used cups, rinsed them in the small sink by the door, and left them on the rack to dry. He turned before stepping out. Next week we can go back to sarcasm, right? Of course, Laurie said. Balance demands contrast. He nodded, eyes briefly bright under dimness. Good. Wouldn't want anyone thinking I've gone sentimental. They laughed softly once more, but no one contradicted him. Outside, the air carried faint hints of grass thawing beneath frost, the first truth of spring. It crept through the partly open window and wrapped itself around the tea's remaining steam until both smells became one promise. Laurie lingered a few minutes after they left. She walked to the table, touched one still warm mug and whispered, apology accepted, not required. Then she turned out the light, leaving the room glowing faintly from street lamps outside. The empty cups cooled in their orderly row, holding the ghost of shared heat. Proof that even the simplest warmth can complete a complicated sentence. The last week of therapy arrived disguised as any other. The sky hung low but kind, brushed with pale sunlight that carried neither promise nor warning. In the waiting room, the air smelled faintly of chamomile and wood polish, a scent Morty had come to associate with something close to security. When Laurie opened the door, no one spoke. Words felt unnecessary ceremony. The circle of chairs waited exactly as always, but tonight there was something quieter in them, a poised kind of stillness that hinted they already knew the conclusion. Rick stood for a moment before sitting, watching dust spiral through the last fingers of sunlight. So, season finale, he muttered. What? Do we say how much we've grown in roll credits? Laurie smiled. We might, but no speeches required. Just one word, each of you. One word for what you've carried out of all this, Beth laughed softly. You know he'll pick something apocalyptic just to ruin the pattern. That's fine, Laurie said. It will still belong. They settled into a comfortable half-silence while the clock reacquainted itself with rhythm. The sound of ticking, once irritating, now felt like background applause. Morty noticed how everyone breathed slower now, matching that steady pulse. Even Laurie drew a breath. Whenever you're ready, we'll begin counterclockwise. Morty first, he thought for a moment. He could have said understanding or healing, words that looked great printed on brochures, but instead he said stillness. The instant it left his mouth, he realized how true it was. Not the stillness of surrender, but of standing where storms had finished and finding soil firm again. Beth nodded at him, then spoke her own. Curiosity, she smiled shyly. I used to make curiosity an excuse for control. Now it feels like permission instead. Jerry followed, fingers knotted loosely. His word came freer than expected. Patience. Because apparently clocks and marriages can both be fixed if you don't rush them. Summer grinned. flicking hair from her eyes. "Noise," she said. "That's mine." Because now it sounds like company instead of chaos. All eyes turned to Rick. His corner of the ring stayed quietly charged. He shrugged, scanning them one at a time before answering. "Enough," Laurie's eyebrows lifted. "Enough what?" He took a slow sip of coffee he'd brought in his flask. "Enough running, enough proving, enough pretending." "Just enough," no one replied. The word filled the room's dimensions perfectly, weightless and right. Laurie nodded. "Those words belong to you now. They'll continue working even when you're not aware of them." She set her notebook aside and leaned forward, elbows on knees. "No analysis tonight. I only want you to notice the temperature of this room, how it remembers every conversation that softened inside it. That's what healing actually sounds like. The echo has changed." Morty listened. She was right. The old buzz of tension had become a hum closer to music. The building itself seemed to sigh. Beth glanced around. "It almost feels fuller than the first day, even though nothing's happening." "Exactly," Laurie said. "Nothingness is honest space," Jerry chuckled. "So this is closure. Quiet and furniture?" "Exactly that," her smile widened. "We overrate fireworks. They're only silent, split open loud. Outside, wind brushed through the eaves with careful rhythm, threading leaves and stalled rain into its low lullaby. Summer pulled the small stone from her pocket, the one Laurie had given them months ago. "Does it ever stop meaning things?" she asked. "Never," Laurie said. "It only gets smoother with handling." Summer rolled it between her fingers until the edges felt familiar again. "Good. I like knowing it keeps changing without permission." Rick stood abruptly, walking toward the window. "I always thought closure meant some big reveal. Turns out it's just recognizing when no further commentary is required, which," Laurie said gently, "is exactly what growth sounds like in your language." He chuckled under his breath. "Figures." Morty watched his grandfather's reflection in the glass, shoulders still, posture unguarded, face softened by the dull orange of the streetlight outside. For the first time, Rick looked like someone who could stay anywhere. "Even a moment," Laurie said. "Before you leave, I'd like to read something." She opened the top drawer of her desk and took out a folded sheet, the note Rick had once slid beneath her door. Her voice softened as she recited, "Today's experiment. Test what happens if I let them speak without interruption." I'd say the results were definitive. Rick turned, half-smile trembling toward humor. "They interrupted plenty. That was the test succeeding." The group laughed quietly, almost reverently. Laurie closed the note, tucking it back into the drawer like an artifact properly archived. "From here on, you won't need this room. Therapy isn't this circle anymore. It's every pause you respect, every small kindness you perform by reflex," Beth whispered. "So we graduate." "If that's the word you want," Laurie said. "I prefer continuation." They stood slowly, reluctant but peaceful. Coats whispered, mugs clinked. Rick lingered one extra second, eyes narrowing, as if recording the geometry for future replication. He reached into his pocket and placed his stone on Laurie's table beside the candle. "Consider it data sample complete." She studied the dull gray surface reflecting the faint lamp glow. "Some experiments end themselves." Rick gave a single nod. "Guess this one did its job." Summer added her stone. Then Beth, then Jerry. Even Morty placed his last, arranging them in a loose spiral that mirrored the pattern of their chairs. Laurie looked at the collection. "Together they almost glow," she said. "That's how memory works. Quiet luminescence." Outside, wind rose for a moment and fell again. The room held its breath, then released it collectively. Laurie broke the hush one final time. "You've all done well. You're allowed to feel ordinary again." Rick opened the door, pausing on the threshold. "You sure the world's ready for our baseline version?" "It's always been waiting," she said. He half saluted, the casual gesture of someone acknowledging both teacher and mirror. One by one, they stepped into night. The hallway smelled of rain and afterthoughts. Down the stairs, their footsteps fell in uneven yet harmonious rhythm, a family orchestra improvising farewell. On the landing, Morty looked back once. Through the glass panes, Laurie was extinguishing the candle, her face haloed by the brief smoke curling upward before it disappeared. Something in that gesture looked exactly like a benediction. Outside, the world absorbed them easily, night cool against faces, wind threading through conversation. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't need to. The silence following them was fluent in every language they'd learned here. When they reached the car, Beth touched the roof lightly, grounding herself. "Stillness," she said, echoing Morty's word. "Curiosity," he answered. Rick climbed into the driver's seat. "Enough," he reminded them, content. He started the engine, the hum steady as a heartbeat. As they drove off, the light from Laurie's office flickered once, then settled into soft permanence, waiting for whatever stories might need that glow next. Behind them, time clicked forward with grace instead of ambition. Therapy had ended, but something larger had just learned how to rest. The week after the final session didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a pause inhaling before exhale. The house woke slower now, as if the walls themselves were trying to practice what Laurie had taught them. Stillness before purpose. The Smiths followed suit. Their lives resumed the old patterns, but the rhythm had softened. Small, ordinary miracles threaded themselves between hours, delicate and quiet. Beth noticed first. She was standing in the kitchen when she realized she was humming. The tune had no name. It danced somewhere between melody and sigh. The kettle clicked. The refrigerator responded in counterpoint, and for once she didn't rush to fill the silence. Jerry entered, half asleep, scowling at his tie. "Something different?" he asked, pausing at her smile. "I'm happy," she answered simply, as if testing the word's new elasticity. He nodded, unsure what his part in that miracle was, but grateful to witness it. Upstairs, Summer's alarm buzzed, but she didn't hit snooze. She plugged in a playlist that wasn't defensive this time. Soft, lazy songs that left room for thought. On the ceiling, faint morning light traced slow-moving patterns. She stared up and whispered, "One normal day." Coming right up. Finding herself half laughing at how sacred normal could feel, Morty sat outside on the porch steps, letting cold air chew at his fingers while sunlight licked the wet pavement. He found himself breathing the way Laurie had taught them, longer on the exhale, deliberate, untheatrical. A few blocks away, some child's bicycle bell chimed. He smiled. The sound had the same key as his stillness. Rick appeared at the door behind him in a swirl of coat and mild disapproval. "You mediating or napping upright?" "Meditating, I guess," Morty said. "Or just sitting. Same thing, different branding." Rick lowered himself beside him, groaning for show more than ache. Out over the neighbor's lawn, the magnolia's late buds were forming, stubborn white against cold air. "Guess the tree didn't get the memo on seasons," he said. "It did," Morty said. "It just decided not to wait." Rick looked at him, and a slow grin sketched the corner of his mouth. "Careful, kid. You're quoting metaphors without hazmat gloves." They sat a while in synchronized quiet, two silhouettes caught between laughter and legacy. The morning breeze wandered through the open door behind them, filling the house with something living yet effortless. Fresh air disguised as renewal. Inside, Jerry replaced the worn bulb over the porch. He didn't announce it, just twisted the glass until the filament caught and hummed back to life. Light spread across wet floorboards, the same warm yellow that had followed them from Laurie's office. He stepped down and joined Beth at the sink, both of them rinsing coffee cups without crowding. The sound of water formed their conversation's punctuation. "You ever think we'll forget everything she taught us?" he asked. Beth shook her head. "Memories fade. Habits heal." That's enough. Later that afternoon, Rick set to tinkering, not to escape but to create gently. The garage smelled of oil and slightly burnt sugar from his latest experiment. A porch bulb that would never quite burn out, but would dim when the world needed rest. Morty watched, mesmerized. "Why a light and not, a miracle machine?" he asked. Rick shrugged. "Miracles have lousy maintenance schedules." He soldered two thin wires together, each spark no louder than a cat purring. "Light's honest. It just stays until it doesn't." That evening, the family shared dinner without planned ceremony, one of Jerry's edible surprises. Conversation floated over clinking forks, work stories, the joke about horses eating paperwork, Summer's claim that she'd seen a frog slip on ice. Every laugh sounded fuller, partly because there was no one left auditioning for sincerity. They were all just living it bit by bit. After dishes, Beth opened the window above the sink. Cool night entered, tasting of frost and exhaust. Across the street, neighbors' houses glowed in their muted amber, each one carrying a private version of peace. Morty joined her, leaning on the counter. He said, I keep thinking therapy should have made things louder. Big revelations, huge change. Instead, everything just feels quiet, Beth smiled. Silence can be the loudest kind of success. Behind them, Rick was unscrewing the old porch light, whistling off-key. Jerry held the ladder still, while Summer scrolled through music on her phone to find something that fit the pacing of Screwdriver against glass. She settled on a slow instrumental piece. The melody swelled easily through open windows into night, absorbing city sounds until everything aligned. When the new bulb flickered on, no one spoke. The glow brushed each of their faces, warm and unassuming. The same hue as candlelight in Laurie's office. For a moment they simply stood there, 5 figures cupped in halo, looking up like travelers admiring proof of direction. Rick climbed down carefully, landing among a scatter of leaves. There, porch light's smarter than half our inventions. Jerry looked up at the steady light, unblinking. It's nice, it feels earned. Don't get sentimental, Rick said, but his voice failed at sounding cynical. Summer tucked her phone away. If we ever have another family crisis, can we schedule it under this light? It flatters everyone. They laughed, and the laughter stretched easily into silence, the comfort kind. Round and calm, Beth inhaled deeply, arms folded across her chest, eyes drifting toward stars filtered through city haze. For once, she said, the world doesn't look like it's watching us. It's just joining in. Morty nodded. I think that's aftercare, Rick frowned. Which means maintenance for feelings, Morty replied. Like oiling the quiet parts, Rick chuckled. You should copyright that before therapists steal it. Laurie would probably insist it belongs to everyone, Summer said. Yeah, Morty added. She'd say peace with royalties isn't peace at all. They lingered there a long while. One by one they moved back inside, but not far. The door stayed half open to let the porch light seep into rooms, tracing a golden thread from table to hallway to stairwell. It touched photographs on the wall, small dust motes mid-flight, even the corner where the cat used to sleep. Every surface glowed just enough to suggest life being lived correctly for a change. Rick waited until the house calmed. Then he murmured to no one in particular, Guess we passed the test, huh? Beth, already halfway up the stairs, turned. We're still taking it, she said gently. He accepted that with a nod. Tests worth passing never end. They just get quieter. The night stretched wide and calm over the neighborhood. Somewhere a train called out, deep and low, a sound not of departure but of continuance. Inside, cups dried on their racks, clocks held steady, breathing aligned. The porch bulb kept its silent watch, and the house at last seemed perfectly content to rest. The first true chill of early spring set in that week, an in-between cold that smelled like iron and melting snow. The air had that clean taste of beginnings disguised as farewells. Late afternoon tilted toward dusk, when Morty decided to return to Laurie's office. No appointment, no plan, just the kind of pull that comes when memory tugs at the sleeve. He walked there alone. Everyone else was busy with their re-entered lives. Beth closing at the clinic, Summer with friends, Jerry cooking something ambitious and happily doomed. Rick was in the garage polishing the porch light circuitry, swearing softly in satisfaction each time it glowed the same as before. For Morty, solitude felt lighter these days, less exile, more belonging to silence. The building looked smaller now, the same way childhood homes shrink once you learn how to carry them inside. The front door's brass handle was cool and smooth, familiar even through his gloves. He stepped into the faint amber light of evening trembling through the high windows. The waiting room sighed around him. Dust swirled like memory rehearsing choreography. Laurie wasn't there, but she didn't need to be. The door to the old therapy room was unlocked, as if left on purpose. Inside, the circle of chairs remained stacked neatly against the far wall, each one tilted slightly outward, like petals half closed at night. On the table lay a single object, Rick's notebook. Its spiral edges gleamed faintly, the pencil wear on its cover softer now, gentler from handling. Morty approached, fingers brushing its edge. Beneath it, a folded note in Laurie's small cursive waited, for whoever needs to remember differently. He smiled, not the kind that surfaces for pictures, but the kind the heart sends upward when it recognizes an old friend. He sat in Rick's chair, the one that never faced the window, though now he angled it toward the light on instinct. Outside, rain hadn't started yet, but the air was waiting for it. He flipped open the notebook and discovered new writing in Laurie's steadier hand, a single page labeled Legacy Hour. Legacy isn't what's left behind. It's what remains carried forward once weight learns how to balance. Families are physics experiments that refuse to end. Fragments circling, gravity forgiving. If you are reading this, remember, you're already the continuation. You don't need permission to keep the experiment kind. Morty exhaled carefully, as if a sound might disturb the ink. For a while he just sat, hands flat on the paper as though anchoring himself to clarity. The room gathered around him, full of old laughter stored in fibers. The smell of candle wax that had long since cooled. He pictured each of them, Beth humming without noticing, Jerry's tie crooked in optimism, Summer's steady grin, Rick soldering light into patience. They weren't healed. They were ongoing, scattered chords humming the same key. Across from him, on Laurie's desk, sat the small collection of stones they'd left behind. Time had dulled their shine to matte calm. Morty stood and walked to them, tracing each one with a fingertip. He found his bifeel, a small nick on one side shaped like a crescent. He pocketed it again, whispering, borrowing it back. Continuation clause. The clock above him, Jerry's repaired masterpiece, still ticked steady. Its sound filled the room's edges like soft rain does windows. The rhythm became an echo of heartbeat, its repetition not relentless but reassuring. Existing, existing, existing. When Laurie finally appeared in the doorway, she didn't look surprised. She wore her usual calm, the kind that made time behave. "I thought I might find you here," she said quietly. He smiled. "Is it okay?" "It's yours as much as mine," she answered, stepping inside. "Every patient leaves something unfinished. You were the only one brave enough to come back to see what that means." Morty laughed softly. "I don't feel brave. Just curious. That's bravery wearing gentleness," she said. They stood near the window. Outside, the first raindrops finally arrived, mapping the glass in patient trails. Laurie watched the water fall, her reflection overlapping his in the window pane. "How's everyone?" "Still awkward. Still loud sometimes. But a bit easier," he said. "And Grandpa's been nice, like accidentally nice." "Niceness by accident counts double," she said, and they both smiled. Morty hesitated. "Do therapy rooms remember things?" "They remember intentions," Laurie said. "Walls hold what's spoken into them kindly. That's why this place never feels empty." He nodded. "I wanted to thank you for all of it." She gave a small shrug, almost embarrassed. "I only reminded you of things you already owned." Rain intensified, each drop a faint percussion above her words. Morty returned to Rick's chair, turning it once more toward the window. The gesture felt natural, honoring something previously resisted. "He always sat away from the light," he said. Laurie's voice softened. "Then you've done the only repair left to make." For a while they simply listened. The rain became music. The ticking clock joined. The city hummed below. All around them the air felt kind, scented with metallic calm and warm paper. Finally she said, "He'll come back here one day, you know. Not for therapy, but maybe to fix a hinge or test a theory about nostalgia." "I'll leave a note," Morty said. "Something simple in case he forgets why he came." "Good plan." "Legacy is just documentation written in trust." Morty closed the notebook gently. The lamp above flickered at that perfect moment where light remembers it can be soft. "I think we graduated," he said. "No," Laurie corrected. "You've just been promoted to teaching yourselves." Morty chuckled. "That sounds harder." "It should. The best lessons always round back to living." He stood, pocket heavy with stone and rain scent. "Well, class dismissed then?" "Class continues," she said, smiling. As he stepped outside, twilight stretched across everything in a uniform blue. The air tasted clean, rain mixing with city dust until both became perfume of renewal. From across the street, he could see the porch light glowing faintly through the mist. The invention Rick swore wasn't sentimental. Its reflection shimmered across puddles, multiplying into small fragments of dawn. Morty whispered to no one, "Guess we're all light keepers now." Far behind him, inside the empty room, the tick of the repaired clock seemed to answer. Still here, still here. Night came dressed in silver. It slipped quietly over roofs and fences, over the magnolia tree that had decided to bloom a few weeks early, and finally settled on the Smith's porch, where a single light shone. The one Rick had wired with equal parts science and sentiment. Its glow wasn't bright, Just enough to make the air visible, a warm handshake offered to darkness. Inside, the house had the low hum of contentment. Dinner dishes sat drying in the rack. The television played at whisper volume, reruns of something familiar enough not to require attention. It was one of those evenings when the world finally seemed caught up, nothing left demanding explanation. Beth brewed cocoa even though it was nearly 11. She filled a mug too full, handed it to Jerry with an unspoken look that said truce for tonight, then poured another for herself. "It's still strange not rushing anywhere," she said, settling beside him on the porch swing. "Strange good," Jerry replied. He took a sip, burned his tongue, and laughed quietly. "Guess I'm out of practice at peace." She nudged him with her shoulder. "We all are." A few minutes later, the door creaked again and Summer padded out wrapped in a blanket, patterned with tiny suns. Behind her came Morty, hair wild from a late shower, and finally Rick, carrying a thermos the color of tarnished hope. He unscrewed the lid, steam curling upward like ghosted equations. Without invitation or ceremony, they all sat. The swing swayed. Boards complained pleasantly beneath their combined weight. The porch light hummed its steady tune above them, a bass note too low for notice until you learned how to listen for comfort. The sky overhead was clear tonight, and thousands of stars hummed back in their own language. Rick studied them quietly, expression folding inward. Morty broke the silence first. "You ever get tired of stars?" Rick shook his head. "Not the real ones. Just the versions people make wishes on. They always want the sky to do their heavy lifting." Summer smiled. "That's kind of beautiful in a pessimistic way. Beauty's just logic with empathy," he answered. "Same math, softer lighting." They laughed. The mellow, late-night kind that lets memory breathe trimmed edges. Beth leaned against the swing's arm, fingers circling her mug. "Do you ever miss the sessions?" Morty thought about it. "Sometimes. But I think we still have them." "Here, like this," Beth nodded. "Home just stole the idea." Rick snorted softly. "Figures. Quantum plagiarism." Laurie's words came back to Morty then. "You're already the continuation." He looked around, his mom smiling because Dad finally remembered to relax. Summer tracing constellation shapes with her free hand and naming them after playlist moods. Rick pretending irritation at every display of affection, but staying exactly where he was. He thought, yeah, we continued. A wind stirred the magnolia branches, scattering a drift of petals across the stairs. Their shadows looked like tiny paper cranes, echoes of Beth's dream. She noticed first. "Guess my mind still folds things when I'm not watching." Rick followed her gaze. "Origami evolution." "You're welcome." Jerry lifted his mug toward him. "Two accidental miracles," the porch murmured with quiet agreement. Minutes slipped by. Conversation became fragments. A story about one of Summer's friends who melted crayons for art. A joke Morty told badly. The soft scolding of Rick correcting his math mid-punchline. Their laughter left and returned like the tide. Even pauses felt friendly. After a while, Morty asked, "What would Laurie say if she saw us now?" Beth grinned. "She'd check her notes, call it progress, and ask for her chair back." Jerry added, "Then take credit for the cocoa." Rick's voice came low and sure. "She'd tell us the experiment's stable. First time anything collectively human achieved it." They let that linger. Somewhere a train passed in the distance, its horn soft, elongated. The faint vibration traveled through the porch boards and into their feet. It felt like the planet sighing. Summer whispered, "I didn't think peace had a soundtrack." "It does," Morty said. "It just doesn't need volume." When the wind shifted again, it carried the smell of earth waking. Grass, rain from days before. Faint smoke from chimneys up the street, all mingling into chemistry that even Rick didn't analyze. He inhaled, smiled despite himself. "Data confirms," he murmured. "The universe isn't broken. It's just catching its breath." That earned another ripple of laughter. A cat somewhere answered with solemn meow, the evening's small applause. Beth rested her head briefly on Rick's shoulder. He stiffened at first, then gave in, a subtle lean back that said fine, but only for 30 seconds. 30 seconds stretched effortlessly into comfort. Jerry watched them and whispered, "You're a good dad, you know." Rick didn't respond, just stared at the yard as if equations might carve gratitude into grass. Finally he said, "You all turned out better than my math predicted." Summer grinned. "Statistically impossible, love. My favorite genre." They sat until cocoa cooled, until the porch light's glow deepened toward honey gold. The neighborhood quieted except for an occasional dog bark, a rustle from trees, and the rhythmic creak of the swing. The sound matched the heartbeat of contentment, slow, constant, mercifully dull. Morty leaned back and whispered, "Do you think we'll stay like this?" Rick looked up at the stars, glasses catching one faint glint. "No," he said. "But the porch light will." That seemed enough. They all watched the bulb's steady shimmer, the faint halo spilling over the railing, touching the yard, the path, the street beyond. It made even distant shadows look less alone. Beth said quietly, "Maybe that's legacy, leaving one lamp on for whoever's still finding the house." Rick clinked his empty thermos against her mug. "Sounds measurable." Morty smiled, eyes closing halfway. The light blurred and pulsed gently, the way all bedtime lights do just before sleep claims them. His head tipped sideways onto the backrest. Summer pulled the blanket higher across everyone's knees. Jerry sighed, a satisfied sound, and Beth's breathing slowed. Rick alone stayed awake a little longer, staring at the bulb he'd built, and the family it illuminated. He whispered to it, or perhaps to the universe itself, "Stay on." The bulb hummed its reply, a near-silent agreement, and somewhere, in the thin space between family noise and cosmic quiet, the scientist, the dreamer, the curious, and the tired all rested in the same soft frequency. Night expanded gently around them, keeping its promise of calm. "Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man."